In the next 2 hours, you'll discover Michelangelo as history has never dared to reveal him. Not the saintly genius of legend, but a man who called himself a tyrant, who suffered crushing loneliness whilst creating humanity's greatest art, and who spent a lifetime wrestling with forbidden desires whilst painting the very ceiling of God's house. Like this video if you think it will help you sleep, and subscribe for more groundbreaking conversations with history's most fascinating figures. Which historical figure would you most want to share tea with? Drop your answer below. I read every comment from fellow history lovers like you, and your suggestions inspire future episodes. Now let me hand you over to Olivia, who's travelled back in time to Michelangelo's final workshop in Rome, surrounded by unfinished sculptures and the weight of 8 decades spent in service to divine beauty, where the master reflects on a life of artistic triumph and human sacrifice. So dim your lights, get comfortable, and close your eyes. This is Tea with Tyrants and Heroes.
Now, Michelangelo, the name of this show is Tea with Tyrants and Heroes, so I have to ask you directly, do you consider yourself a tyrant or a hero? And I want you to really justify your answer. Don't give me the easy response. Tell me why you believe that about yourself.
A tyrant or a hero? Madonna mia, what a question to lay before an old man's conscience. You know, I've spent decades wondering this very thing myself, especially in my final years when the weight of my choices pressed down upon me like those massive stones I carved. If I'm honest, and what purpose would there be in dishonesty now? I fear I was often a tyrant, particularly to myself, but yes, to others as well. I was merciless in my pursuit of perfection. I dismissed apprentices who couldn't match my vision. I raged at assistants who dared to touch my work. I drove myself to physical and spiritual exhaustion because I believed, no, I knew, that anything less than absolute excellence was an insult to God. I was tyrannical in my standards because I believed I was serving something infinitely greater than my own comfort or the feelings of those around me. When you're painting the hand of God giving life to Adam, when you're carving the face of Christ in his mother's arms, you cannot afford to be nice. You cannot prioritize human politeness over divine truth. But was this tyranny justified? Did my cruelty serve a higher purpose, or was it simply the selfishness of a man who cared more about his legacy than the people around him? This is what haunts me. I think perhaps I was a tyrant in service of something heroic. I tyrannized my body, working until my hands bled and my back screamed in agony during those years on the chapel ceiling. I tyrannized my social life, refusing invitations, avoiding friendships that might distract me from my calling. I tyrannized my financial comfort, often living like a pauper despite commissions that could have made me rich because I reinvested everything back into my art, my vision. But here's where I struggle with calling myself heroic. A true hero serves others selflessly. Did I serve others, or did I serve my own need to create? When people weep before my pietà, when they feel closer to God because of something I carved from stone, am I responsible for that spiritual experience, or was I merely the chisel in the Almighty's hand? I suspect the truth is that I was both tyrant and hero, often simultaneously. I was tyrannical in my methods, but heroic in my intentions. I crushed the small, daily kindnesses that make life bearable because I was serving a beauty that would outlast all our small daily sufferings. The real question isn't whether I was a tyrant or hero to others. It's whether I was heroic enough to endure my own tyranny. And some days, lying in that chapel with paint burning my eyes and my soul crying out for mercy, I'm not sure I was. Perhaps the truest heroism would have been learning to be gentler with the man God made me to be.
Your honesty is remarkable, and I can feel the weight of that internal struggle. Now, since we're sharing tea together, do you actually like English tea?
In my time, this would have been quite exotic. We had wine, we had water, sometimes milk if we were fortunate, but this is rather lovely, warming, though I confess I've added rather too much honey. My sweet tooth was always my weakness.
I love that even the master had a sweet tooth. Now, I have to ask about what might be your most famous work. Everyone wants to know what it was really like painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. People search endlessly for the truth behind those 4 years.
Ah, the chapel. People speak of it as my masterpiece, and perhaps it is, but they have no conception of what it cost me, not in ducats, but in flesh and spirit and sanity. First, let me dispel the romantic notion that I lay on my back painting like some sort of Renaissance sunbather. That's nonsense perpetuated by foolish films and ignorant storytellers. I stood, my neck craned back at an impossible angle, paint and plaster raining down into my eyes until they burned and wept constantly. My beard became a canvas of colours that I neither chose nor wanted, but the physical agony was nothing compared to the spiritual torment. You must understand, Pope Julius II didn't commission this work because he admired my painting. He knew me as a sculptor, and a reluctant one at that, when it came to this particular project. I fought him. I told him to find Raphael, someone who actually enjoyed painting. But Julius was, well, he was called the warrior pope for good reason. When he wanted something, refusal wasn't truly an option. So there I was, a sculptor forced to become a painter, tasked with depicting the entire story of creation on a ceiling so vast that even shouting from one end, you could barely be heard at the other. 9 scenes from Genesis, over 300 figures, and every single one had to be perfect because it was going in the most sacred space in Christendom. The loneliness was crushing. For months at a time, it was just me and my few assistants in that cavernous space surrounded by scaffolding that creaked ominously with every movement. The silence was broken only by the scratch of charcoal on paper, the scrape of brushes being cleaned, and my own muttered prayers and curses, often in the same breath. I would begin before dawn and work until the light failed completely. My neck seized so severely that I couldn't look down properly for months. I had to peer at people sideways like some sort of broken bird. My right arm, from holding it above my head for hours each day, developed a permanent tremor that took years to subside. But the worst part, the constant fear that I was failing God. Every day I climbed that scaffolding knowing that if my vision wasn't true, if my technique wasn't perfect, I would be creating a lie in the house of the Almighty. The pressure of that responsibility nearly drove me mad. I would lie awake at night, terrified that I had painted Adam's face incorrectly, that I had misunderstood the divine expression I was meant to capture. And yet, there were moments of such transcendent joy that I understood why God had chosen this particular suffering for me. When I painted the finger of the Almighty reaching toward Adam, I truly felt, that I was participating in the act of creation itself. My hand, guided by divine inspiration, was adding to the beauty of the world in a way that would speak to human souls for centuries. The day I finally descended from that scaffolding for the last time, I wept, not from relief, though there was that, but from a strange grief. For 4 years, that ceiling had been my entire universe. Those painted figures had been my companions. Leaving them behind felt like abandoning children I had birthed through suffering.
The way you describe that spiritual connection to your work is extraordinary. But I know there's another artist who people constantly ask about, your relationship with Leonardo da Vinci. The rivalry between you two is legendary.
You know, it's strange how history has painted us as these great enemies, circling each other like artistic gladiators. The truth is far more complicated and, frankly, more painful than a simple rivalry. I was 29 when we were both commissioned to paint battle scenes in the Palazzo Vecchio, his Battle of Anghiari, my Battle of Cassina. Florence wanted to see which of us was truly superior. Can you imagine the pressure? Not just from the city, but from every artist, patron and observer in Italy watching to see who would emerge victorious. Leonardo was already established, celebrated, almost mythical in his reputation. I was still proving myself, still fighting for recognition beyond my sculpture. And here's what people don't understand. I wasn't just competing with him artistically. I was competing with everything he represented. The perfect Renaissance man, the gentleman artist, the charming courtier who could discuss philosophy with princes and dissect corpses with physicians. I was a stonecutter's son who preferred marble dust to conversation, who found socializing exhausting and small talk insufferable. Leonardo glided through society like a swan on still water. I stumbled through it like a bull in a pottery shop. But my God, could that man draw? His understanding of anatomy, his grasp of engineering, his ability to see the mechanics of flight in a bird's wing, it was almost supernatural. I studied his work obsessively, though I would have died before admitting it at the time. His sketches taught me things about the human form that years of dissecting corpses in monastery basements had only hinted at. The tragedy is that we could have learned so much from each other if we hadn't been positioned as rivals. I could have benefited from his scientific approach, his methodical study of proportion and movement. Perhaps he could have learned something from my understanding of stone, of how to see the figure trapped within the marble waiting to be freed. Instead, we performed this elaborate dance of mutual disdain. I mocked his inability to finish projects, and yes, that frustrated me enormously about him. How could someone with such divine talent be so scattered? He would start a painting, become fascinated by the properties of his experimental paints, abandon the work to study water flow, then become obsessed with designing flying machines. It seemed like waste to me, almost sinful in its squandering of gifts. But I think I understand now, in my old age, that Leonardo's restless mind was part of his genius. While I focused intensely on individual masterpieces, he was trying to understand the entire universe. My approach created individual works of beauty. His approach advanced human knowledge itself. The real rivalry wasn't between Leonardo and me. It was between two different ways of serving God through art. He sought to understand creation by dissecting it, studying it, explaining it. I sought to participate in creation by adding to its beauty. Both approaches have merit, both serve the divine in their own way. I wish we had found a way to be friends. I think we would have enjoyed debating theology over wine, arguing about the best methods for mixing pigments, sharing the loneliness that comes with seeing beauty everywhere and feeling responsible for capturing it. Instead, we wasted years in pointless competition when we could have been collaborators in beauty.
That regret is so palpable. Two titans who could have been allies. Let me ask you about another work that people are endlessly curious about, David. When people search for you, they want to know what it was like creating that statue, why you chose to show him before the battle rather than after.
David. Now there's a story that still makes my heart race. You see, when the Opera del Duomo offered me that commission, they brought me to see this massive block of marble that had been sitting, abandoned, for nearly 40 years. Two other sculptors had already attempted something with it and failed, leaving it scarred and partially carved, deemed worthless by most. But when I saw it, voice becomes reverent. When I saw it, I knew exactly who was trapped inside that stone. David was waiting for me, had been waiting for decades, and I was simply the instrument chosen to set him free. Why before the battle, you ask? Because that's when courage truly matters. Any man can celebrate after victory. It takes no particular bravery to pose triumphantly when your enemy's head is already at your feet. But that moment before, That instant when David sees Goliath approaching, when every rational thought screams at him to run, when his faith in God is the only thing standing between him and certain death. That's when you see the true measure of a soul. I spent weeks just looking at that marble, walking around it, touching it, learning its grain and its weaknesses, understanding where the stone wanted to break and where it would resist. People thought I was mad, spending so much time with a block of stone, but you cannot simply attack marble with a chisel. You must court it, seduce it, convince it to reveal its secrets. The physical work was extraordinary. This wasn't delicate carving. This was a 17-foot giant that required me to use tools most sculptors never touch. I built scaffolding, rigged pulleys, developed new techniques for rough cutting that massive bulk down to something approaching human form. My hands bled daily, my arms ached constantly, and the marble dust filled my lungs until I coughed white powder for months. But the spiritual work was even more demanding. You see, I wasn't just carving a statue of David. I was trying to capture the moment when human will aligns perfectly with divine purpose. David's expression had to show both his youth and his absolute certainty in God's protection. His body had to display both the vulnerability of a shepherd boy and the unstoppable power of righteous fury. That face. I must have carved and recarved those features dozens of times. The eyes especially tormented me. They had to show focus without strain, determination without arrogance, divine confidence without human pride. I would work on his gaze for hours, then step back and realize I had made him look angry when I needed him to look resolute, or determined when I needed him to look faithful. And the hands, everyone comments on David's hands. They're overlarge, out of proportion. But this was intentional. These are the hands that will guide the stone to Goliath's forehead, hands that must be strong enough to serve as instruments of divine justice. I made them large because the task they were about to perform was larger than any merely human action. The most profound moment came near the end when I was polishing his face. I found myself praying as I worked, asking God to let me see David as he saw him. Not as a boy with a sling, but as a vessel for divine will. And suddenly it was as though the marble face was looking back at me, as though David himself was approving of my work. When we moved the statue to the Piazza della Signoria, half of Florence turned out to watch. It took 4 days to transport him, and I walked alongside that entire journey, terrified that some accident would destroy 3 years of my life. But when he was finally in place, when I saw people weeping before him, I knew I had succeeded in freeing the David who had been waiting in that stone for 40 years.
The way you describe feeling connected to your creations is beautiful and moving. But that makes me curious about your human relationships. People often wonder about your personal life, whether you ever found love or companionship.
You touch upon the great ache of my existence. Love, companionship, these were luxuries I both craved and fled from in equal measure. The truth is, I was terrified of intimate human connection, and I think I know why. When you spend your life trying to create perfect beauty, when your entire purpose revolves around achieving the ideal in stone and paint, the messy reality of human relationships becomes difficult to navigate. People are wonderfully, frustratingly imperfect. They have needs that interrupt your work, emotions that demand attention when you're lost in creative transport, expectations that you simply cannot meet when God is calling you to your easel or your chisel. There were people I loved, yes. Tommaso de Cavalieri, a young nobleman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence. My feelings for him were intense. Complicated, perhaps inappropriate by the standards of our time. I wrote him sonnets, passionate letters that I'm sure shocked him with their intensity. But what could I offer him, really? A life lived in service to art, where human love always came second to divine inspiration. And Vittoria Colonna, the poetess, There was a woman who understood the spiritual dimensions of creativity. We spent hours discussing theology, art, the intersection of human love and divine love. With her, I felt less alone in my artistic calling, but even that beautiful friendship was constrained by my inability to give anyone, even someone as remarkable as Vittoria, the full attention they deserved. The painful truth is that I chose loneliness. Not consciously, perhaps, but through 1,000 small decisions that prioritized my work over human connection. When friends invited me to dinner, I would decline because the light was perfect for painting. When potential lovers expressed interest, I would retreat into my studio because intimacy felt like a threat to my creative purity. I convinced myself this was noble sacrifice, that I was like a monk dedicating his life to God. And perhaps there was truth in that. My art was my prayer, my devotion, my service to the Almighty. But monks have their brotherhood, their community of shared purpose. I chose a solitary path that sometimes felt more like punishment than devotion. The loneliness was particularly crushing during the long months working on the Sistine Chapel. Day after day of solitary labor, surrounded by painted figures who felt more real to me than most living people. I would have conversations with Adam, arguments with the prophets I was painting. These imaginary companions became more familiar to me than my actual acquaintances. But here's what's strange. I don't regret my choices, not entirely. The intensity of my solitude fed my art in ways that a more conventional life never could have. When you have no one to talk to about your deepest thoughts, those thoughts find their way into your work with unusual power. My loneliness became part of my artistic voice. Still, in my final years, lying in bed with no one to hold my hand as death approached, I wondered if I had been too pure in my devotion to art, too unwilling to accept the beautiful imperfection of human love. Perhaps God would have understood if I had allowed myself both artistic devotion and human companionship. Perhaps the two could have enriched each other rather than competing for my soul.
That loneliness is heartbreaking, and I think many creative people will recognize that struggle between art and human connection. But speaking of devotion, people are fascinated by your complex relationship with the Catholic Church. You created some of their greatest artworks, but you also lived through the Reformation.
My relationship with the Church, it was like being married to someone you love desperately but don't always like very much. The institution and the divine truth it represented were often at odds in ways that tormented my soul. I was, am, and will always be a faithful Catholic. My belief in God, in Christ's sacrifice, in the beauty of divine creation. These were not simply intellectual positions for me. They were the very foundation of my existence. Every stroke of my brush, every strike of my chisel was a prayer, an attempt to participate in God's ongoing act of creation. But the men who led the church during my lifetime, Shakes head Madonna Mia, some of them seemed more interested in temporal power than spiritual truth. Pope Julius II, who commissioned the Sistine Chapel, was as much a warrior as a priest. He spent more time planning military campaigns than contemplating scripture. And yet, this same man had the vision to commission works that would speak to souls for centuries. The contradiction was maddening. How could the same institution that produced such corruption also inspire such transcendent beauty? How could I serve God through an organization that sometimes seemed to forget God entirely? During the years of the Reformation, when Luther was posting his theses and the Protestant movement was gaining strength, I found myself sympathizing with some of their criticisms whilst remaining utterly loyal to Catholic doctrine. Yes, there was corruption in the church hierarchy. Yes, some practices had become more about enriching the Vatican than saving souls. But did that invalidate the essential truth of Catholic teaching? I couldn't accept that it did. My solution was to serve God directly through my art whilst maintaining respectful distance from church politics. When Pope Paul III commissioned me to paint the Last Judgment behind the altar in the Sistine Chapel, I painted Christ as a figure of terrifying divine justice, perhaps more terrifying than the Pope would have preferred. My Christ wasn't the gentle shepherd of popular devotion. He was the righteous judge who would separate the saved from the damned with absolute authority. Some of the cardinals complained that my figures were too nude, too sensual for sacred space. They wanted me to add clothing to make the work more appropriate. But how can you make the human form, God's greatest creation, inappropriate? The body isn't shameful, it's divine architecture made flesh. I painted nude figures because I was celebrating God's craftsmanship, not indulging in sensuality. But explaining this to men who saw sin where I saw beauty was exhausting. The most painful aspect was watching the church's response to reformist ideas. Instead of addressing legitimate criticisms, too often the response was suppression, violence, defensive rigidity. I still believe, that the church's truth was strong enough to withstand questioning, that honest inquiry would only strengthen faith rather than weaken it. In my private prayers, I often begged God to help His church remember that divine truth is beautiful, not fragile. Beauty doesn't need to be defended with swords and stakes. It defends itself simply by being beautiful. My art was my contribution to that defense, creating works so obviously touched by divine inspiration that they would draw souls toward God regardless of political or theological controversies. But yes, it was lonely being caught between my absolute faith in Catholic truth and my deep frustration with Catholic leadership. I served the Church faithfully whilst praying constantly for its purification and renewal.
Your faith, despite institutional frustrations, shows such spiritual maturity. And that leads me to ask about probably the most famous single image you ever created, the creation of Adam's scene on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. When people search for you, that finger touch between God and Adam comes up constantly.
The breakthrough came during one of my sleepless nights. I was lying in my bed, exhausted from another day of failed attempts, when I suddenly understood that the power of the scene wasn't in the touching, it was in the space between the fingers. That tiny gap where God's finger nearly touches Adam's represents the greatest moment in all of creation. The instant before life, when everything is potential, when the breath of God is about to become the soul of man. Painting God was terrifying. Every morning when I climbed the scaffolding to work on his face, I trembled. What if I got it wrong? What if my limited human vision couldn't capture even a shadow of divine majesty? I gave him the face of an ancient patriarch, wise and powerful but also tender. This is God as loving Father, not God as terrible judge. And the way he moves through space, supported by angels but clearly in command of cosmic forces. I wanted to show that creation isn't effortless for God, that even divine love requires intention, will, purpose. God isn't casually flicking Adam into existence. He's investing something of himself in this moment. But Adam was perhaps even more challenging. How do you paint a man who is perfect but not yet fully alive? His body had to be beautiful beyond any living human. This is humanity as God intended it, before sin, before suffering, before death. But his face had to show the stirring of consciousness without full awareness, desire without knowledge, readiness without understanding. I gave Adam the body of a young athlete because this is man in his physical prime, but I painted his expression with the wonder of a child seeing light for the first time. His finger reaches toward God but without urgency. He doesn't yet understand what he's about to receive. He only knows that something wonderful is approaching. The most extraordinary thing happened while I was painting that scene. For weeks, I had been struggling with Adam's expression, unable to capture the right combination of innocence and anticipation. Then one morning, I climbed up to the ceiling and found myself looking directly into Adam's painted eyes, and for just a moment, I swear I saw consciousness flicker there, as though my painted figure was receiving life from my gaze. It was the closest I ever came to understanding what God must have felt in that original moment of creation. The indescribable joy of bringing something beautiful into existence. The love that motivates divine creativity. I wept on that scaffolding, understanding that I had been privileged to participate, however humbly, in the ongoing act of creation itself. When visitors to the chapel see that scene now, many of them instinctively reach out with their own fingers, unconsciously mimicking Adam's gesture. They're responding to something primal in that image, the recognition that we are all still reaching toward the divine touch that gives our lives meaning.
That moment of divine connection gives me chills, but I'm struck by how you mention struggling and failing repeatedly before achieving these masterpieces. People often ask about your perfectionism. Was it a gift or a curse?
There's a gentle word for what was actually a form of spiritual torture I inflicted upon myself daily. You ask if it was a gift or curse, and the honest answer is that it was both simultaneously my greatest strength and my most destructive weakness. You must understand I didn't choose perfectionism as an artistic strategy. It chose me as surely as God chose me to be a sculptor. From my earliest days in Ghirlandaio's workshop, I was physically incapable of accepting good enough. If a line wasn't precisely right, if a shadow didn't capture the exact emotional truth I was seeking, if a marble surface wasn't as smooth as skin itself, these imperfections would torment me until I corrected them, no matter the cost in time, materials, or physical exhaustion. This compulsion served me well in creating works that have endured for centuries, but the personal cost was staggering. I would abandon projects that were already magnificent because they didn't match the impossible standard burning in my mind. The number of sculptures I destroyed because they were merely excellent instead of perfect, it pains me to remember. The Pietà was perhaps the clearest example of both the blessing and curse of my perfectionism. I carved and recarved Mary's face dozens of times because I couldn't capture the exact expression I needed. Grief without despair, sorrow without bitterness, maternal love that transcended even the agony of watching your son die for the sins of others. Most sculptors would have settled for very good and moved on. I literally carved my fingertips bloody trying to achieve perfect. But here's the paradox that nearly drove me mad. The closer I came to perfect execution, the more clearly I could see how far short I still fell of perfect conception. Each technical breakthrough only revealed new layers of inadequacy in my vision. It was like climbing a mountain only to discover that each summit revealed an even higher peak beyond. My perfectionism made me impossible to work with, I'll admit that freely. Assistants would bring me work that any other master would have praised, and I would point out 17 flaws that needed correction. I drove away talented apprentices who could have learned from me because I couldn't bear to watch them create anything less than excellence. The worst part was how perfectionism poisoned my ability to enjoy my own achievements. Normal people complete a difficult task and feel satisfaction, pride, rest, but I would finish a piece that others called miraculous, and all I could see were the small compromises I had been forced to make, the places where the marble hadn't quite cooperated, the subtle ways the final work fell short of my original vision. I remember the day we unveiled David in the Piazza della Signoria. All of Florence was celebrating. People were weeping with joy, calling it the greatest sculpture ever created, and I stood there cataloguing every tiny imperfection I hadn't been able to correct. A slightly uneven surface on his left shoulder, a shadow that wasn't quite right around his eyes. But, and this is crucial, Those same impossible standards also produced something genuinely transcendent. When people stand before my work 500 years later and feel their hearts lift toward God, when they see beauty that changes their understanding of what human hands can create, that happens because I was never willing to settle for good enough. My perfectionism was a form of prayer, a way of offering God the very best I was capable of. If that devotion required me to sacrifice personal happiness, social relationships, even physical health, well, perhaps that was the price required for creating beauty that could speak to souls across centuries. The tragedy is that I never learned the difference between perfectionism in service of divine beauty and perfectionism as an expression of human pride. One serves God, the other serves only the ego's fear of criticism. I fear I spent too many years unable to distinguish between the two.
That distinction between divine service and ego is profound. Speaking of challenges, people are always curious about your relationships with your patrons, particularly Pope Julius II. What was it like working for such powerful, demanding clients?
The patrons. Working with Pope Julius II was like being employed by a force of nature, magnificent, terrifying, and completely unpredictable. People assume that having wealthy, powerful patrons made my life easier, but the truth is that it often made it exponentially more complicated. Julius wasn't just a client, he was the warrior pope, a man accustomed to commanding armies and conquering territories. When he decided he wanted something from you, he approached it with the same military strategy he used for capturing cities. Refusal wasn't an option, he recognized. I'll never forget our first major confrontation over the Sistine Chapel commission. I had just begun preliminary sketches when he burst into the chapel. And when I say burst, I mean he literally kicked open the doors with his papal boots, demanding to see progress on work I'd barely started. When I tried to explain that great art requires time for planning and contemplation, he responded by threatening to have me thrown from the scaffolding. But here's what made Julius simultaneously maddening and magnificent. His vision was genuinely extraordinary. Yes, he was impatient, demanding, sometimes unreasonable, but he understood that he was commissioning work that would outlast his papacy, outlast his century, perhaps outlast the very stones of Rome itself. When he looked at that chapel ceiling, he didn't see an inconvenient expense. He saw an opportunity to create something eternal. The man had an absolute genius for knowing when to push an artist beyond their comfort zone. I would have been content painting a few apostles on that ceiling and calling it finished. Julius forced me to envision the entire story of creation, the fall of man, the promise of salvation, the complete theological narrative of humanity's relationship with God. I hated him for that pressure at the time, but without it, the Sistine Chapel would have been merely beautiful instead of transformative. Working with the Medici family presented different challenges. They were more sophisticated patrons, better educated in artistic matters, but also more subtle in their manipulations. Where Julius would shout his demands, the Medici would make gentle suggestions that carried the weight of absolute command. Perhaps, dear Michelangelo, you might consider, but you knew that consideration wasn't optional. The political complexities were exhausting. Every commission came with unspoken requirements about which families to honor, which political messages to embed, which theological positions to emphasize or avoid. I was supposed to be creating timeless beauty, but I was constantly navigating contemporary politics and the money. People assume great artists were well compensated, but the reality was often feast or famine. Patrons would commission massive projects, then find reasons to delay payment when their political fortunes shifted. I spent months living on bread and water while waiting for Julius to remember that he owed me enough ducats to feed a small army. But perhaps the most challenging aspect was the way patronage constrained artistic freedom whilst simultaneously enabling it. Without Julius's commission, the Sistine Chapel ceiling would never have existed, but his specific requirements also meant I couldn't paint exactly what my artistic vision demanded. I had to find ways to serve both my patrons' needs and my own creative truth, often in the same brushstroke. The successful artist learns to navigate these constraints creatively. When Julius demanded more profits on the ceiling, I gave him profits, but I made them so psychologically complex, so emotionally compelling, that they transcended mere decoration and became spiritual presences. I served his requirement whilst serving my own higher artistic purpose. Looking back, I'm grateful for the difficult patrons. Easier clients would have produced easier art. The tension between their demands and my vision forced me to find solutions I never would have discovered in complete creative freedom. Some of my greatest innovations came from trying to satisfy impossible requirements whilst maintaining artistic integrity.
That balance between constraint and creativity is fascinating. But I'm struck by how often you mention physical pain and exhaustion. People don't often think about the physical demands of being a sculptor and painter.
Physical demands. That's a gentle way to describe what was essentially decades of controlled violence against my own body in service of beauty. People see the finished David or the completed Sistine Chapel and imagine some sort of effortless divine inspiration flowing through blessed hands. The reality was far more brutal. Sculpture, particularly sculpture on the scale I attempted, is fundamentally about imposing your will upon matter that doesn't want to cooperate. Marble is beautiful, yes, but it's also unforgiving. One poorly placed chisel strike can destroy months of work. The stone fights back. It throws chips that cut your face, dust that fills your lungs, vibrations that travel up your arms until your shoulders scream for mercy. My hands holds up weathered hands. These hands tell the story of my devotion better than any biography. See these calluses? They're from gripping chisels for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time. These scars, marble chips that cut deep enough to leave permanent marks. This tremor, from years of holding my arms above my head, painting the chapel's ceiling. But the real damage was systemic. Standing on scaffolding with my neck craned backward for months at a time permanently altered my spine. I developed a forward head posture that made me look like a vulture, attractive for someone hoping to maintain social connections. My right shoulder sits higher than my left from countless hours of hammering, and my back curves in ways that would make a physician weep. The respiratory damage was perhaps worse. Marble dust is beautiful when it catches sunlight streaming through a workshop window, but when it's coating your lungs day after day, year after year, I coughed up white powder for decades. My breathing became labored, my voice grew raspy, and I lived in constant fear that my lungs would simply give out before I could complete my vision. Then there were the daily indignities. My hands would shake so severely after a long day of detailed carving that I couldn't hold a spoon steady enough to eat soup. I would fall asleep still gripping imaginary chisels, my fingers locked in position until the pain woke me. The muscle cramps in my forearms were so severe that I would sometimes weep from the agony. But you know what's strange? I wouldn't trade a single moment of that suffering. Every ache, every scar, every respiratory struggle was evidence of my devotion to something greater than personal comfort. My broken body was the price I paid for the privilege of creating beauty that would outlast flesh. The physical demands also created a strange intimacy with my work. When you've bled onto a piece of marble, when your sweat has mixed with stone dust to create the paste that polishes a sculpture's surface, when your very breath becomes part of the creative process, the work isn't separate from you anymore. It becomes an extension of your physical being. I remember one particularly brutal day working on David's face. I had been carving for 14 hours straight. My hands were bleeding, my back was in spasms, and I was beginning to make mistakes from exhaustion. Any sensible person would have stopped, rested, returned fresh the next day. But I could see David's expression emerging from the stone, could feel him coming alive under my tools, and I knew that stopping would break the spiritual momentum. So I continued, pushing through pain that would have felled a weaker man, and in that extremity of physical suffering something transcendent happened. My conscious mind, overwhelmed by pain, seemed to step aside, and I felt as though divine hands were guiding my tools. The final details of David's face were carved in a state of exhausted ecstasy that I've never been able to replicate or fully explain. This is why artists of my generation aged so quickly. We understood that creating lasting beauty required the sacrifice of temporary flesh. Modern artists have easier lives, better tools, more comfortable working conditions. But I wonder if they can achieve the same intimacy with their medium that comes from literally bleeding for your art.
The way you describe that transcendent state through suffering is remarkable. But that makes me think about your unfinished works. You left quite a few sculptures and paintings incomplete. Was this perfectionism or something else?
The unfinished works. They haunt me more than any criticism ever could. You see them as abandoned projects, but to me they represent souls I failed to set free, promises to God that I couldn't keep, beauty that died because of my limitations. People count my incomplete sculptures, the prisoners, the Rondinini Pietà, so many others, and assume I was simply disorganized or uncommitted, but the truth is far more painful. I didn't abandon these works, they abandoned me. Or rather, I reached the limits of what my human hands could achieve, and the gap between my vision and my ability became unbridgeable. Take the prisoners, those 4 figures struggling to emerge from their marble blocks. When I began carving them, I could see them so clearly in the stone, could feel their desire for freedom calling to my chisel. But as I worked, I discovered that the marble itself was flawed in ways I hadn't anticipated. Veins ran through critical areas, weaknesses appeared where I needed strength, and gradually I realized that freeing these figures completely would risk destroying them entirely. So I faced an agonizing choice: abandon the work or risk ruining it by attempting completion. I chose abandonment, but it felt like leaving prisoners in their cells when I had the key. Those half-emerged figures torment me because they represent the closest I ever came to literally giving life to stone, and my failure to complete that divine act. The psychological weight of unfinished work is crushing in ways people don't understand. Each incomplete piece becomes a monument to your inadequacy, a daily reminder that your reach exceeded your grasp. I would walk through my workshop and feel the reproachful gaze of half-carved faces, the pleading gestures of arms that would never be fully freed from stone. But there's another reason I left work unfinished that's even more difficult to admit. Sometimes I fell out of love with the vision. The initial inspiration that drove me to begin a piece would fade as the reality of execution revealed the gap between dream and possibility. The passion that sustained me through months of preliminary work would suddenly evaporate, leaving me with technical skill but no spiritual fire. This happened with several papal commissions where the political pressures corrupted my artistic vision. I would begin with genuine enthusiasm, only to realize that I was being asked to create propaganda rather than beauty, decoration rather than truth. My soul would revolt against the work, and I would find excuses to delay, to reconsider, to eventually abandon the project entirely. The most heartbreaking unfinished work was my final Pietà, the Rondinini Pietà. I was in my 80s, my hands were failing, my eyesight was dimming, but I could still see so clearly the image of Christ's broken body in my mother's arms that needed to be carved. I worked on it until just days before my death, trying desperately to capture something I could see but could no longer execute with the precision my vision demanded. In those final months, I understood that the unfinished works weren't failures. They were the natural result of attempting something greater than human capability allows. Every artist who truly reaches for the divine will leave behind evidence of that reaching in the form of incomplete visions. But oh, the regret to know that somewhere in those abandoned blocks of marble were figures that could have moved souls, that could have revealed new aspects of divine beauty. That knowledge is a special kind of torture for an artist. We're haunted not just by what we created, but by what we failed to create. Perhaps the unfinished works serve a purpose I couldn't see while I lived. They show future artists that even masters struggle, that even divinely inspired vision bumps against human limitation. They're honest in a way that completed masterpieces can never be. They reveal the struggle, the uncertainty, the very human process of reaching for perfection and falling short.
That perspective on incompletion as honest revelation is beautiful. But speaking of struggle, what were your deepest fears? What kept Michelangelo awake at night?
Then there was the fear of divine punishment for my pride. You see, I knew I was gifted beyond most men, not through any virtue of my own, but through divine grace. But knowing this made me constantly worried about hubris. Was I using my gifts to serve God, or had I begun serving my own glory? When people called me divine Michelangelo, I felt sick with terror that I was accepting praise that belonged only to the Almighty. I feared madness, genuinely and constantly. The intensity of my creative visions, the way I could see completed works so clearly in my mind before beginning them, the conversations I had with my painted and carved figures. Sometimes I wondered if I was losing my grip on reality. When you spend more time with imaginary people than real ones, when your sculptures feel more alive to you than your neighbors, sanity becomes a precious, fragile thing. Physical fears tormented me as well. I was terrified of going blind before completing my work. My eyes were my most precious tools, more valuable than my hands, and I lived in constant anxiety about injury or disease robbing me of sight. I developed elaborate rituals for protecting my vision, special candles that burned more cleanly, careful positioning to avoid marble chips, prayers specifically for the preservation of my eyesight. But perhaps my deepest fear was dying with my greatest work still trapped inside me. I could feel masterpieces waiting to be created, visions that God had planted in my soul that hadn't yet found expression in stone or paint. The thought of leaving this world with those divine gifts unrealized was more terrifying than any physical suffering. I feared being forgotten, yes, but more than that, I feared being remembered for the wrong reasons. What if future generations saw my work as mere technical achievement rather than spiritual expression? What if they admired my skill whilst missing the divine truth I was trying to convey? Fame without understanding seemed worse than obscurity. There were nights when all these fears would converge into a kind of spiritual panic that left me gasping for breath. I would feel simultaneously insignificant in the face of divine creation and overwhelmed by the responsibility of participating in that creation. How can one human soul bear the weight of trying to add beauty to God's perfect universe whilst knowing that any failure dishonors the very source of all beauty? My fear of human intimacy was tied to all of this. I was terrified that if I allowed myself to love someone fully, to be truly known by another person, they would see how broken and frightened I really was beneath the artistic reputation. Better to remain alone than risk having someone discover that the great Michelangelo was actually a trembling, uncertain man desperate for divine approval. The strangest fear was of my own success. When a work turned out better than I had hoped, when I achieved something that felt truly inspired, I would be gripped by terror that I had used up some finite store of divine favor. What if God had only given me a certain amount of artistic grace, and I was spending it too quickly? These fears never left me, never diminished with success or age. If anything, they intensified as my reputation grew, because the stakes of failure became higher with each completed masterpiece. Each success raised the bar for the next work until I felt like I was climbing an infinite ladder toward an impossible standard of perfection.
Those fears show such a deeply sensitive soul. As someone who created works that seemed to transcend mortality, how did you think about death and your own mortality?
Death. It was both my greatest terror and my most trusted companion. You see, when you spend your life trying to create things that will outlast your flesh, you develop a very complicated relationship with your own mortality. I thought about death constantly, not in a morbid way, but as an artist thinks about light, as the condition that gives meaning to everything else. Every chisel strike, every brush stroke was made with the knowledge that I had limited time to complete my divine assignments. Death wasn't the enemy of my art, it was the deadline that gave my work urgency. But oh, how I feared dying with work undone, not just the practical incompletion of specific projects, but the spiritual incompletion of my purpose. I felt as though God had given me a finite number of breaths, and each one spent not creating was somehow wasted. This made me ruthless with my time, dismissive of pleasures that didn't serve my artistic calling. As I aged and my body began failing, my hands growing stiff, my eyes dimming, my back refusing to support long hours of work, I experienced a peculiar panic, not fear of death itself, but fear of obsolescence while still living. What good is an artist who can no longer trust his hands? What purpose does a sculptor serve when he lacks the strength to lift a hammer? I began carving my own tomb when I was still relatively young, not from any death wish, but from a desperate need to ensure that my final resting place would reflect the same artistic standards as my life's work. I couldn't bear the thought of being buried beneath mediocre sculpture, of having my earthly conclusion dishonor my divine calling. The Rondinini Pietà, my final sculpture, became my meditation on mortality. I worked on it until days before my death, and in those last months I understood that I was carving my own farewell to the world. Every gentle curve of Mary's face, every tender fold of Christ's broken body was my way of preparing for the transition from creating beauty to becoming part of the eternal beauty I had always served. But here's what's strange. As death approached, I felt less fear and more curiosity. I had spent my entire life trying to glimpse divine truth through art, catching brief flashes of eternal beauty in temporal materials. Death promised to reveal what I had only guessed at, to show me the perfect beauty that my imperfect works had tried to echo. I wondered if God would show me the completed visions that my human hands had been unable to realize. Would I finally see the perfect David that I had attempted to free from marble? Would I understand the full glory that I had only partially captured in the Sistine Chapel? Death might be the completion of my artistic education. The physical process of dying was less frightening than I had anticipated. Pain I knew well from decades of artistic labor. Weakness I had experienced during periods of intense creative focus. My body had always been a tool for serving beauty. When it was no longer capable of that service, releasing it felt almost natural. What moved me most in my final days was realizing how many people had been touched by my work, how my attempts to serve God through art had somehow helped others find their own connections to divine beauty. Students, visitors, fellow artists would describe how my sculptures or paintings had moved them to prayer, to tears, to their own creative efforts. I began to understand that my work had achieved a kind of immortality that transcended my personal mortality. I prayed constantly during those last weeks, not for more time, but for assurance that I had used my time well. Had I been a faithful steward of the gifts God had given me? Had I added genuine beauty to the world? Or had I merely satisfied my own need for recognition? The final irony is that death, which I had feared would end my ability to create, actually completed my greatest work. The transformation of a frightened, driven man into someone who could face eternity with the quiet confidence that comes from having served something greater than oneself. My last coherent thought was a prayer of gratitude, not for my achievements, but for having been chosen to participate, however imperfectly, in the ongoing creation of beauty in God's universe.
That gratitude and peace in your final moments is deeply moving. As we approach the end of our time together, how do you want to be remembered? What legacy did you hope to leave?
How I want to be remembered. This is perhaps the question that shaped every conscious decision of my artistic life. Not how I will be remembered. That's beyond my control. But how I hoped to be remembered, what I tried to build with each work that would outlast my mortal frame. I want to be remembered not as Michelangelo the genius, but as Michelangelo the faithful servant. Everything I created was an attempt to serve God through beauty, to participate humbly in the divine act of creation. If people remember my name but forget that my work was prayer made visible, then I've failed in my deepest purpose. I hope that centuries from now, when people stand before David or lie beneath the Sistine Chapel ceiling, they don't think what a talented man created this, but rather what a magnificent God inspired this. I want my art to be a window, not a mirror. Something that draws the viewer's gaze toward divine truth rather than human cleverness. More than anything, I want to be remembered as an artist who refused to compromise with mediocrity, who understood that creating beauty is a sacred responsibility that demands everything you have to give. I want young artists to look at my work and understand that excellence isn't optional when you're serving something eternal. That the difficulty of the calling doesn't excuse half-hearted effort. I hope my struggles, the unfinished works, the physical suffering, the spiritual torment, inspire rather than discourage future creators. I want them to know that even divinely gifted artists doubt themselves, make mistakes, fail to realize their complete vision, but the attempt itself has value. The reaching toward perfection matters even when perfection remains out of reach. I want to be remembered as someone who proved that art isn't decoration or entertainment, but a form of worship, a way of adding genuine beauty to God's creation. When the church was struggling with corruption and doubt, when faith was under attack from every direction, I tried to create works so obviously touched by divine inspiration that they would strengthen belief rather than challenge it. But if I'm completely honest, I also want to be remembered as someone who suffered beautifully for his art. Not suffered needlessly or dramatically, but suffered purposefully in service of something greater than personal comfort. I want the story of my pain to give meaning to other people's struggles, to show that difficult things can produce transcendent results. I hope future generations will understand that my temperament, my difficult personality, my inability to maintain normal human relationships, these weren't character flaws to be excused, but necessary sacrifices for the kind of total dedication that great art requires. I couldn't have created what I created whilst living a conventional life of social pleasures and comfortable compromises. Most importantly, I want my work to continue teaching people about the nature of divine beauty long after my name is forgotten. I want David to keep showing viewers what courage in the face of impossible odds looks like. I want the Sistine Chapel to keep revealing new layers of spiritual truth to each generation that encounters it. I want my Pietà to continue comforting people who have lost loved ones by showing them that even divine love understands grief. I suppose, ultimately, I want to be remembered as someone who took the talents God gave him and multiplied them fearlessly, who didn't bury his gifts in safe, comfortable choices, but risked everything to create beauty worthy of its divine source. If 500 years from now someone stands before one of my works and feels their heart lift toward heaven, if they glimpse something of God's glory reflected in stone or paint, if they understand a little better what divine love looks like, then I will have achieved the only immortality that matters. The greatest legacy any artist can leave is work that continues to serve God's purposes long after the artist's hands have returned to dust. I pray that my marble and pigment will keep singing divine praise until the end of time itself.
Michelangelo, as we finish our tea together, what wisdom would you want to leave with our listeners who are drifting off to sleep? What would you want them to remember as they close their eyes?
My dear souls, as you prepare for sleep, let me share the most important truth I learned through a lifetime of seeking beauty. You are already masterpieces. You see, I spent decades trying to free perfect figures from imperfect stone, believing that beauty was something hidden that needed to be revealed through suffering and skill. But in my final years, I understood that God didn't hide beauty inside marble. He placed it inside you, inside every human soul, already perfect and complete. The divine spark that I tried so desperately to capture in paint and stone lives freely in your breath, your dreams, your capacity for love and wonder. You don't need to earn it through struggle or prove it through achievement. You possess it simply by being alive, by being conscious, by being capable of recognizing beauty when you encounter it. When you close your eyes tonight, remember that the same God who inspired my brush to paint the creation of Adam is the God who knit you together in your mother's womb. The same divine love that moved my chisel to carve David's face is the love that sustains your heartbeat, that brings you safely into sleep and gently calls you back to waking. Don't be afraid of your imperfections, your unfinished aspects, your incomplete dreams. I left behind unfinished sculptures because even master artists cannot complete everything we envision. But incompletion isn't failure, it's humanity. Your unfinished dreams, your partial successes, your works in progress are not evidence of inadequacy, but proof that you're reaching for something greater than yourself. Create something, anything, with your life. It doesn't have to be art. It can be kindness, children, gardens, businesses, friendships, moments of joy you offer to others. But create something that adds beauty to the world, something that serves love rather than fear, something that will outlast your temporary flesh. And when you face difficulties, when your hands shake and your vision dims, when the work becomes harder than you expected, remember that every master has walked this path. The divine uses our struggles to sculpt us into who we're meant to become. Your suffering isn't punishment. It's preparation for beauty you haven't yet imagined. Sleep now in the knowledge that you are loved by the same Creator who filled my heart with visions of angels, who guided my hands to carve faces that still move people to tears. That love surrounds you like the most comfortable blanket, like the warmest embrace, like the safest shelter from every storm. Let your dreams tonight be filled with glimpses of the beauty you're meant to create, the love you're meant to share, the masterpiece you're meant to become. And when you wake, remember that every new day is another chance to add your unique brush stroke to the great canvas of human beauty. Voice fading to whisper, rest well, dear souls. The angels I painted watch over your sleep, and the God who inspired them holds you gently until morning light calls you back to the blessed work of being beautifully, magnificently, divinely human.
Your final words about divine love and human connection bring me to something many people wonder about but rarely discuss openly: your sexuality and romantic desires. There's been much speculation over the centuries.
You ask the question that historians whisper about but dare not voice directly. My sexuality, my romantic desires. These were perhaps the most complicated and tormented aspects of my existence, intertwined with my faith and my art in ways that nearly destroyed me. The truth is that I was attracted to men, particularly young men of exceptional beauty and intelligence. This wasn't something I chose or could change. It was as fundamental to my nature as my ability to see figures hidden in marble. But you must understand, this desire existed in direct conflict with the teachings of the church that gave my life meaning. I fell in love, deeply, desperately, inappropriately, with Tommaso de Cavalieri. He was perhaps 23 when we met, beautiful as a Roman god, intelligent beyond his years, with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. My feelings for him were so intense they frightened me. I wrote him sonnets that bordered on worship, letters that revealed more of my soul than I had ever shown another human being. I live and love in God's peculiar light, I wrote to him, trying to convince myself that my earthly love could somehow serve divine purpose. But the conflict was agony. How could I serve God whilst harboring desires that the church condemned? How could I create religious art whilst my heart burned with what many would call sinful passion? The celibacy I maintained wasn't virtue, it was terror. I was terrified that acting on my desires would corrupt my ability to channel divine inspiration. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that sexual purity was required for spiritual authenticity in my art, so I suffered in silence, pouring my unfulfilled longings into my sculptures and paintings. You see it in David, don't you? The way I carved that young man's body with such intimate knowledge of masculine beauty. That wasn't clinical study, that was love made visible in stone. Every curve of muscle, every detail of anatomy was carved by hands that understood male beauty not just intellectually but viscerally, passionately. The tragedy is that I convinced myself this suffering was noble, that sexual denial elevated my art. But now I wonder if I simply wasted decades of potential joy out of fear. Tommaso might have loved me in return. There were moments when I glimpsed something in his eyes that suggested my feelings weren't entirely unrequited, but I was too frightened to risk finding out. My other great love was Vittoria Colonna, and that relationship was even more complex. With her, I could love openly, safely, because she was a woman and our connection was intellectual and spiritual rather than physical. She understood my artistic calling in ways no one else ever had. We would spend hours discussing theology, poetry, the intersection of human and divine love. But even that pure relationship carried undertones of the romantic desires I couldn't express elsewhere. My sonnets to Vittoria were passionate, though carefully crafted to remain within acceptable bounds. Through her I could experience something approaching romantic fulfillment without risking my soul or my reputation. The cruel irony is that my sexual frustration may have improved my art whilst destroying my personal happiness. All that unfulfilled longing had to go somewhere. It went into the tender way I carved Mary's face in the Pietà, the passionate intensity of Adam's expression in the chapel, the raw emotion that people still feel in my work centuries later. But I paid such a price for that artistic authenticity. Nights of loneliness that stretched into months, years of watching Tommaso age and marry whilst I remained frozen in unexpressed desire, decades of believing that love and art were mutually exclusive rather than potentially complementary. If I could live again, I think I would risk loving more openly, trusting that God's understanding is broader than human doctrine suggests. Perhaps the divine spark I sought in my art was always meant to include the full spectrum of human emotion, including the love that I spent a lifetime denying myself.
That honesty about love and desire is heartbreaking and brave. Taking us back to the beginning, people often search for information about your childhood. What shaped the boy who would become the master?
My childhood. It was marked by absence, by a kind of emotional starvation that perhaps drove me to seek love and approval through art for the rest of my life. I was born in Caprese, a tiny mountain village where my father served as a magistrate, a position that sounds more important than it was. We were minor nobility, technically, but minor to the point of near poverty. My father, Ludovico, was a weak man, proud of our family name, but incapable of improving our circumstances through anything resembling effort or talent. The defining tragedy of my early years was losing my mother when I was only 6. Francesca died when I was still young enough to believe that mothers were permanent fixtures of the world, and her death left a void in my soul that I spent decades trying to fill. Every pietà I ever carved was, in some sense, an attempt to reunite with that lost maternal love. After my mother's death, I was sent to live with a wet nurse in Settignano, a village of stone carvers and quarrymen. People joke that I absorbed marble dust with my milk, and there's truth in that. My earliest memories are of the sound of chisels on stone, the sight of rough blocks transformed into architectural elements, the understanding that human hands could impose beauty on raw material. But it wasn't a warm household. My wet nurse was kind but distant, caring for me out of obligation rather than affection. I learned early that love was something to be earned rather than freely given, that approval came through achievement rather than simple existence. This lesson shaped every relationship I would have for the rest of my life. My father was complicated. He wanted social advancement for our family but lacked the skill or energy to achieve it himself. When I showed artistic talent, he was initially horrified. Art was considered manual labor beneath our social station. He wanted me to become a merchant or a banker, something that would elevate our family's standing. I remember the day I told him I wanted to apprentice with Ghirlandaio. He struck me, not violently, but with the casual dismissal that hurt worse than any beating. "Art is for servants," he said. "You're a Buonarroti." But I was already lost to art, already seeing the world as raw material waiting to be transformed into beauty. The apprenticeship with Ghirlandaio was my escape from emotional poverty, but it was also isolating in new ways. I was younger than the other apprentices, more serious, more obsessed with perfection. They saw me as odd, intense, antisocial. I preferred studying ancient sculptures to joining their evening revelries, chose technical exercises over social bonding, but oh, the joy of discovering what my hands could do. The first time I successfully drew a human face, the first time I carved even a simple relief, these moments gave me more satisfaction than any human relationship ever had. I understood even as a child that I had been given a divine gift, and that gift came with the responsibility to develop it completely. The loneliness was crushing at times. I would watch other apprentices receive visits from loving families whilst knowing that my father saw my chosen path as a disappointment. I would see master artists surrounded by friends and admirers whilst feeling myself drawn deeper into solitary focus on my craft. I developed what you might call defensive grandiosity. If I couldn't be loved for simply being Michelangelo, I would become so extraordinarily talented that love and admiration would be forced upon me. Every act of artistic devotion was partly motivated by the hope that sufficient excellence might finally earn the unconditional approval I had lost when my mother died. The tragedy is that this strategy worked. I did achieve love and admiration through art, But by then I had become so accustomed to earning affection through achievement that I couldn't trust love that wasn't contingent on performance. Even when people genuinely cared for me, I assumed their affection would disappear if my artistic powers ever diminished. My childhood taught me that beauty could be trusted when people couldn't, that stone and pigment were more reliable than human hearts. This lesson served my art but impoverished my personal life in ways I'm still understanding even now, in death.
That insight into your emotional foundation is profound. You mentioned social advancement. Let me ask about the family that perhaps changed your trajectory most, the Medici. What was it really like being taken into their household?
The Medici. They gave me everything I thought I wanted and taught me that getting what you want can be its own form of suffering. Lorenzo the Magnificent quite literally saved my life, but he also trapped me in a golden cage that took decades to escape. When I was 14, still apprenticed to Ghirlandaio, Lorenzo noticed my work and invited me to live in the Medici Palace, to study their collection of ancient sculptures, to be treated as a member of the family rather than a servant. Can you imagine a stone carver's son suddenly dining with philosophers, poets, the most sophisticated minds in Florence? Lorenzo was magnificent, yes, but in the way a beautiful predator is magnificent. He collected talented people the way others collected gems, not for their own sake, but for the way they enhanced his reputation and power. I was his pet genius, his proof that Medici patronage could discover and nurture divine talent. The palazzo was intoxicating for a boy who had grown up with emotional scraps. Suddenly, I was surrounded by luxury beyond my previous imagination. Silk tapestries, golden plates, libraries containing manuscripts I had only dreamed of reading. More importantly, I was surrounded by brilliant conversation, philosophical debates that stretched late into the night, exposure to ideas that expanded my understanding of art's purpose and possibility. But the price was my independence, though I was too young and hungry for approval to recognize the transaction. Everything I created belonged to the Medici family. My artistic vision was shaped by their preferences, their political needs, their desire to use art for social and religious messaging. I thought I was being elevated. Actually, I was being purchased. The other artists in the household taught me about the complex dynamics of patronage. We were competitors as much as colleagues, each vying for Lorenzo's attention and favor. I learned to present my ideas in ways that appealed to Medici tastes, to anticipate what would please whilst trying to maintain some shred of artistic integrity. Lorenzo's death was devastating but also liberating. His son Piero was less magnificent, shall we say. Where Lorenzo had been a sophisticated patron who understood art's spiritual dimensions, Piero saw artists as decorative servants. He once commissioned me to carve a snowman. A snowman. Can you imagine asking Michelangelo to waste divine talent on something that would melt within days? But the real trauma came with the political upheavals that followed. When the Medici were expelled from Florence, I was suddenly without protection, without income, without the social position that had defined my identity for years. I had to flee the city like a common criminal simply because I had been associated with the wrong family. That experience taught me never again to become completely dependent on any single patron, no matter how generous or sophisticated. The Medici had given me education, opportunity, access to materials and subjects I never could have afforded independently, but they had also taught me that artistic freedom and patronage are fundamentally incompatible. You can have financial support or creative independence, but rarely both. The irony is that my greatest works were created after I escaped the Medici orbit, when I was forced to negotiate my own commissions and maintain my own artistic vision. David, the Sistine Chapel, the Pietà, these masterpieces emerged when I was no longer trying to please refined palace tastes, but trying to serve God and my own understanding of beauty. I remained grateful to Lorenzo until my death, but it was a complicated gratitude. He discovered my talent, yes, but he also nearly suffocated it with luxury and expectation. Sometimes the greatest gift a patron can give an artist is the necessity to struggle, to fight for their vision, to earn rather than inherit their artistic authority. The Medici years taught me that comfort can be more dangerous to artistic development than hardship, that being protected from the world's rough edges can prevent you from developing the spiritual calluses necessary for great art. Beauty emerges from tension, from the friction between vision and constraint, not from having every desire effortlessly fulfilled.
That tension between comfort and creativity is fascinating. Now, as someone who revolutionized both sculpture and painting, people are endlessly curious about your actual techniques. What were your trade secrets?
Now you ask about the practical magic. People assume great art emerges from pure inspiration, but the truth is that divine vision means nothing without precise technical knowledge. Let me share secrets that I guarded jealously during my lifetime. In sculpture, everything begins with listening to the stone. This isn't poetic metaphor, it's literal truth. Each block of marble has its own personality, its own internal stresses and weaknesses. Before making a single cut, I would spend days walking around the block, touching it, even pressing my ear against it to understand how it wanted to break. I developed a technique I called liberation carving. Instead of imposing my will on the stone, I would find the figure that was already there and simply remove everything that wasn't part of it. This required seeing the completed sculpture in 3 dimensions before beginning, holding the entire finished work in my mind whilst carving from multiple angles simultaneously. My chisel technique was revolutionary, though I kept it secret for obvious reasons. Most sculptors work from one face of the stone inward, but I developed a method of carving from all sides at once, maintaining perfect proportions by using a complex system of measurements and reference points. I could carve an eye on one side of a head whilst simultaneously shaping the corresponding ear on the other side, keeping the entire skull in perfect proportion. For marble selection, I personally visited the Carrara quarries, sometimes spending weeks finding the perfect stone. I could identify flaws that other sculptors missed, could see how veins would affect the finished work, could predict which blocks would hold fine detail and which would crumble under precise carving. The quarrymen thought I was mad, talking to stones, but I was having conversations with potential masterpieces. My polishing technique was perhaps my greatest technical secret. The final surface of marble sculpture determines whether it looks like stone or like living flesh. I developed a 12-stage polishing process using progressively finer abrasives, finishing with powders so fine they were nearly invisible. The final stage involved polishing with my bare hands until the marble felt warm to the touch. In painting, my innovations were equally radical but differently challenging. The Sistine Chapel required me to master fresco technique under impossible conditions, painting on wet plaster whilst lying on scaffolding with paint dripping into my eyes. I developed new pigment mixtures that would remain vivid despite the chemical reactions of drying plaster. My color theory was based on divine light rather than natural observation. I studied how light behaves in sacred spaces, how candlelight transforms color differently than sunlight, how spiritual emotions could be evoked through specific color combinations. The blues in the chapel ceiling weren't chosen for realism, but for their ability to suggest divine infinity. For figure painting, I dissected corpses, dozens of them in monastery basements by candlelight. This wasn't academic study, it was spiritual research. I needed to understand not just how muscles looked, but how they felt, how they moved, how they connected to bone and sinew. Only by understanding the mechanics of divine creation could I hope to depict it accurately. My drawing technique combined mathematical precision with emotional intuition, I used complex geometric systems to ensure perfect proportions, but I also drew with my emotions, allowing spiritual inspiration to guide my hand even whilst following precise measurements. The result was figures that were anatomically perfect but emotionally alive. The secret of creating expressive faces was understanding that beauty isn't about perfect features, but about the soul visible behind the features. I would study people's faces during moments of intense emotion, prayer, grief, joy, anger, learning how spiritual states manifest in physical expression. But perhaps my greatest technical innovation was learning to work in a state of controlled spiritual ecstasy. I developed meditation practices that allowed me to enter a trance-like state whilst maintaining precise motor control. In this state, I felt as though divine hands were guiding my tools whilst my conscious mind observed the emergence of beauty I hadn't consciously planned. These techniques required decades to perfect and nearly killed me multiple times. The physical demands were enormous, the spiritual demands even greater, but they allowed me to create works that seemed to transcend human capability, art that appeared divinely inspired because it literally was. I had learned to make myself a transparent vessel for divine creativity whilst maintaining the technical skill necessary to manifest that inspiration in permanent materials.
Those techniques sound almost supernatural. But let's talk about something more earthly. People often wonder about the business side of being a Renaissance artist. How did you handle money and financial negotiations?
Money. The necessary evil that every artist must grapple with but no artist wants to discuss. People imagine that great artists live above such mundane concerns, but the truth is that financial worry was a constant companion throughout my life, shaping my decisions and sometimes corrupting my artistic vision. The fundamental problem was that creating great art requires enormous investments of time, materials, and labor, but patrons expected to pay as little as possible, whilst demanding as much as possible. Every commission was a negotiation between my artistic integrity and my need to eat, house myself, and purchase the finest materials. I learned early to be my own business manager, out of bitter necessity. Other artists relied on intermediaries who took substantial percentages whilst offering little protection against unscrupulous patrons. I developed a reputation for being difficult in negotiations, but that difficulty protected me from exploitation that destroyed many talented artists of lesser business acumen. The Sistine Chapel Commission was a perfect example of Renaissance business complications. Pope Julius II agreed to pay me 3,000 ducats for the ceiling work, a substantial sum, but only if you understood what was actually required. What seemed like generous payment became inadequate when you factored in 4 years of labor, the cost of scaffolding, assistance, materials, and the physical toll that prevented me from taking other commissions. But Julius was notorious for delayed payments. I would complete months of work, submit invoices, then wait additional months for payment whilst my expenses continued mounting. I was essentially providing free loans to the Vatican whilst living on bread and water, hoping the Pope would remember his financial obligations. I learned to demand partial payments in advance, to negotiate penalty clauses for late payment, to retain ownership of preliminary sketches that could be sold if primary commissions fell through. These weren't artistic considerations. They were survival strategies that every successful artist had to master. The David Commission taught me about the politics of public funding. The Opera del Duomo was nominally paying for the sculpture, but the real money came from competing political factions who wanted to influence the statue's placement and symbolic meaning. I learned to play these factions against each other, increasing my payment whilst maintaining artistic control. But money created moral dilemmas that tormented my conscience. Wealthy patrons would offer enormous sums for private works, whilst the church needed my services for projects that served God's glory but paid poorly. Do you serve mammon or the divine? Can you justify creating frivolous decoration for the rich whilst sacred spaces remain unadorned? I developed a complex system for balancing these competing demands. I would accept lucrative private commissions that funded my ability to work on less profitable but spiritually important projects. David was partially financed by profits from Medici family portraits that bored me but paid extremely well. The emotional toll of financial uncertainty was crushing. I would wake at night worried about meeting payroll for my assistants, about affording the finest Carrara marble, about maintaining my workshop when commissions were delayed or cancelled for political reasons. Financial stress infected my artistic process, making me rush work that deserved contemplation or compromise vision to meet budget constraints. But I also learned that financial independence was essential for artistic freedom. Once I had accumulated sufficient savings to survive between commissions, I could afford to reject projects that didn't inspire me, to take time perfecting works rather than rushing to completion, to maintain my standards even when clients pressured me to economize. My final years were financially comfortable but spiritually complex. I had more money than I needed but felt guilty about wealth when so many suffered in poverty. I began giving away substantial sums to charity, partly from genuine altruism but partly from fear that God would judge my prosperity harshly. The irony is that my financial success ultimately freed me to create my greatest works. When I no longer worried about money, when survival wasn't dependent on pleasing difficult patrons, I could focus entirely on serving divine beauty. Financial security allowed spiritual luxury, the luxury of perfectionism, of taking time, of serving God rather than gold. Money was never an end in itself, but a means to artistic independence. Every ducat saved was another day I could spend perfecting my vision rather than rushing to satisfy someone else's inferior understanding of what art should accomplish.
That balance between money and artistic freedom resonates deeply, but people often forget you weren't just a visual artist, you wrote poetry as well. Tell me about your sonnets and literary work.
My poetry. Those were the children of my soul that I was almost too embarrassed to acknowledge. People knew me as a sculptor and painter, but words were perhaps my most honest medium, the place where I could express thoughts too intimate or complex for stone and pigment. I began writing poetry as a young man, partly because the intellectual atmosphere of the Medici household encouraged literary experimentation, but mostly because I had feelings that couldn't be carved or painted. How do you sculpt longing? How do you paint the specific ache of unrequited love? Poetry became my outlet for emotions that visual art couldn't contain. My sonnets to Tommaso de Cavalieri were love letters disguised as spiritual meditations. I couldn't write openly about my desire for him. Such honesty would have destroyed both our reputations. So I developed a complex vocabulary of divine metaphor that allowed me to express passionate love whilst maintaining plausible spiritual interpretation. I live and love in God's peculiar light, I wrote, trying to convince both Tommaso and myself that earthly love could serve heavenly purposes. But the real message was simpler and more dangerous. I loved him beyond reason, beyond social convention, beyond my own peace of mind. Writing allowed me to explore the theological tensions that visual art couldn't address directly. In my religious paintings, I had to present orthodox Catholic doctrine, but in my private poems, I could wrestle with doubt, question church authority, explore the possibility that divine love might be broader and more inclusive than official teaching suggested. My sonnet cycles were really extended prayers, attempts to understand how human creativity relates to divine creation. The greatest artist has no conception which a single block of marble does not potentially contain, I wrote. but I was really asking whether human imagination could truly originate anything, or whether we simply discovered beauty that God had already placed in the world. The poetry also served as emotional archaeology, helping me understand the psychological sources of my artistic compulsions. Why was I drawn to depicting the human form? Why did religious subjects move me more than secular ones? Why did I find beauty more compelling than comfort? Writing forced me to examine motivations I had always taken for granted, but publishing poetry felt more vulnerable than displaying sculpture. A statue can be interpreted multiple ways. A poem reveals the artist's inner life with uncomfortable directness. I was terrified that my verses would expose the spiritual and sexual confusion that I worked so hard to conceal in my public persona. My poems to Vittoria Colonna were different, safer, but perhaps more emotionally honest. With her, I could explore the intersection of human and divine love without fear of scandal. Our poetic correspondence became a kind of spiritual courtship, two souls seeking God through the beauty of language and shared artistic understanding. The technical aspects of poetry fascinated me as much as the emotional expression. I loved the mathematical precision required for proper meter, the way syllable counts and rhyme schemes created structures within which meaning could unfold. Poetry satisfied the same part of my mind that delighted in anatomical accuracy and architectural proportion. Writing also provided relief from the physical demands of visual art. When my hands were too painful for carving or my eyes too strained for detailed painting, I could still create beauty through words. Poetry became my companion in old age when my body began failing but my mind remained sharp. But I was always conflicted about the value of my literary work. Poetry felt too easy compared to the physical struggle of sculpture, too dependent on emotion rather than skill. I worried that my poems revealed weakness rather than strength, that they showed the world a Michelangelo who was uncertain rather than masterful. The most honest poetry came during my darkest periods, when commissions were delayed, when patrons disappointed me, when loneliness became unbearable. Writing became a form of emotional bloodletting, a way of releasing pressures that might otherwise have driven me mad. Looking back, I think my poems may be more revealing of my true character than any sculpture or painting. They show the doubt behind the confidence, the spiritual seeking behind the religious orthodoxy, the human heart beating within the artistic reputation. They're the autobiography I was too frightened to write directly.
Your poetry sounds deeply personal and moving. On a more practical level, people are curious about your daily life. What was a typical day like for Michelangelo?
A typical day? Well, there was nothing typical about my days, but there were patterns born of necessity and obsession. My routine was designed around one principle: maximizing the hours available for creation whilst minimizing the time wasted on merely existing. I woke before dawn, usually around 4 in the morning, not from discipline but because my mind would begin racing with artistic visions that made further sleep impossible. The early hours were precious. My hands were steadiest, my eyes sharpest, my spiritual connection to divine inspiration strongest before the world's distractions intruded. My first act was always prayer, but not the formal recitations most people performed. I would have conversations with God about the work ahead, asking for guidance, for steady hands, for vision clear enough to serve divine beauty properly. These prayers were collaborations, planning sessions between the divine artist and his inadequate assistant. Breakfast was minimal, often just bread, perhaps some cheese if I remembered to purchase it. I learned early that heavy meals made my hands sluggish, my mind cloudy. I needed my body to be a precise instrument rather than a satisfied organism. Hunger kept me sharp, alert, properly desperate to create beauty. The morning hours from sunrise until midday were reserved for the most demanding work, detailed carving, precise painting, anything requiring absolute technical control. This was when I made my most important artistic decisions, when divine inspiration was most likely to guide my tools toward perfect expression. I would work in absolute silence when possible. Conversation, even background noise, shattered the delicate concentration necessary for great art. My assistants learned to communicate through gestures, to anticipate my needs without verbal instruction. The workshop operated like a monastery devoted to serving beauty through disciplined silence. Midday brought forced breaks, not from choice but from practical necessity. The Italian sun made detailed work impossible. The light was too harsh, the heat too oppressive for precision. I would use these hours for planning, sketching, studying ancient works, or handling the business correspondence that sustained my artistic freedom. Meals were interruptions I tolerated rather than enjoyed. I would eat whatever was convenient, bread, olives, perhaps some wine, whilst continuing to sketch or contemplate artistic problems. Food was fuel, nothing more. I was often so absorbed in creative problems that I would forget to eat entirely, working until dizziness reminded me of my body's needs. The afternoon hours were for rougher work, blocking out major forms, preparing surfaces, mixing pigments, tasks that required energy but less precise control. As my hands grew tired from morning precision, I could still accomplish meaningful work that advanced larger projects without risking fine details. Evenings were for correspondence, financial planning, and the social obligations that sustained patronage relationships. I despised these requirements but understood their necessity. A few hours of diplomatic conversation with wealthy patrons could fund weeks of uninterrupted creative work. But the most important part of my daily routine was the hour before sleep, when I would review the day's work not with my eyes but with my soul. I would mentally examine each brush stroke, each chisel mark, asking whether it served divine beauty or merely satisfied human ego. This daily spiritual accounting kept me honest about my motivations. My personal habits were eccentric by normal standards. I rarely changed clothes whilst working on major projects. The same tunic would serve for weeks because changing garments interrupted my spiritual connection to the work. I would sleep in my boots during intensive periods because removing them suggested the work might stop, and stopping might break the divine flow of inspiration. I was obsessive about hand care. My hands were more valuable than any other possession. I developed elaborate routines for protecting them. Special gloves for rough work, careful exercises to maintain flexibility, herbal treatments for cuts and strains. Other men might insure their homes. I treated my hands as irreplaceable treasures, but perhaps my strangest habit was talking to my work. I would hold conversations with sculptures as I carved them, asking the emerging figures for guidance about their proper forms. I would apologize to marble when forced to make cuts I wasn't confident about, thank successful passages for revealing themselves cooperatively. People who observed my daily routine often commented on its intensity, its single-minded focus on artistic creation, but what they saw as obsession felt to me like devotion. Every hour spent not creating was an hour stolen from divine service, time wasted when I could have been adding beauty to God's world.
That devotion is remarkable, though it sounds quite solitary. Did you ever teach students or take on apprentices? People wonder about your legacy in terms of the artists you influenced.
Teaching. There's another area where my perfectionism became both gift and curse. I did take on students, yes, but I fear I was a terrible teacher in conventional terms, too demanding, too impatient, too unwilling to accept anything less than excellence that most young people simply couldn't achieve. My approach to teaching was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. I assumed that anyone who wanted to learn from me would share my willingness to sacrifice everything for art, my spiritual devotion to divine beauty, my tolerance for physical and emotional suffering in service of perfection. But most young people, quite reasonably, wanted to learn skills that would give them comfortable careers, not transform them into tortured seekers of impossible ideals. I remember one particularly promising apprentice, Francesco Urbino, who showed genuine talent for sculpture. I subjected him to the same demanding standards I applied to myself: 14-hour days, endless repetition of basic techniques until they became perfect spiritual preparation before approaching any significant work. The poor boy lasted 3 months before fleeing back to his father's merchant business, probably traumatized by my intensity. The problem was that I couldn't separate technical instruction from spiritual transformation. I didn't just want to teach students how to carve marble, I wanted to convert them to my understanding of art as divine service. But spiritual calling can't be taught. It must be received directly from God. I was trying to manufacture mystics when I should have been simply sharing practical knowledge. My few successful students were those who already possessed something approaching my own spiritual intensity. Daniele da Volterra, for instance, understood instinctively that art was prayer made visible. With him, I could share not just techniques, but the deeper purposes those techniques served. He became less a student than a spiritual brother in the service of beauty. But even with my best students, I struggled with a fundamental teaching dilemma. How do you share insights that came through decades of unique personal struggle? My understanding of anatomy was inseparable from my own spiritual wrestling with the relationship between flesh and soul. My color theories emerged from my particular relationship with divine light. These weren't transferable skills, they were personal revelations. I was also catastrophically impatient with normal learning curves. When a student made mistakes that I had moved beyond decades earlier, I would become frustrated, critical, sometimes cruel. I forgot that mastery requires time, that confusion and error are necessary parts of artistic development. I expected instant understanding of concepts that had taken me years to grasp. The irony is that my reputation attracted students from across Europe, young artists desperate to learn from the master. But my teaching style drove away all but the most resilient personalities. I created a filter that selected for spiritual intensity rather than natural talent, which may have been backwards from effective pedagogy. My most successful teaching happened indirectly, through artists who studied my completed works rather than working with me personally. They could learn from my innovations without enduring my impossible personality. Many great artists of the next generation credit my influence, but they absorbed my lessons from a safe distance. I did develop some insights about artistic education that I wish I had applied more systematically. Great artists need 3 things: technical skill, spiritual purpose, and personal resilience. Most teaching focuses only on the first element, but without the other 2. Technical skill produces mere craft rather than transcendent art. But I failed to create systematic methods for developing spiritual purpose and personal resilience in others. I assumed these qualities would emerge naturally from sufficient dedication, but that assumption was wrong. They require different teaching approaches than technical skills, more patience, more acceptance of individual differences. In my final years, I became slightly better at sharing knowledge without demanding transformation. I could offer technical advice without requiring spiritual conversion, could encourage young artists without expecting them to become versions of myself. But by then, my reputation for difficulty had reduced the number of students willing to approach me. My greatest regret about teaching is that I hoarded too much knowledge, shared too little of what I had learned through decades of struggle. I was so protective of my artistic insights that I took many secrets to the grave rather than risking their misuse by unprepared students. Perhaps my real teaching legacy exists in my completed works, which continue instructing artists centuries after my death. The David teaches more about sculptural technique than any verbal explanation could convey. The Sistine Chapel remains a masterclass in compositional complexity and spiritual expression. My true students are those who learn by studying what I created rather than trying to endure what I demanded.
That insight about your works teaching future generations is beautiful. Speaking of different aspects of your legacy, people don't always realize you were also an architect. Tell me about St. Peter's Basilica and your architectural vision.
Architecture. Now there's the art form that truly challenged every assumption I had about creation, space, and the relationship between human scale and divine grandeur. When Pope Paul IV appointed me chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica, I was already in my 70s, an age when most men seek rest, not the most ambitious building project in Christendom. But architecture demanded completely different spiritual and technical approaches from sculpture or painting. With a statue, I was freeing a figure already hidden in the marble. With a fresco, I was revealing divine truth on a flat surface. But with architecture, I was creating space itself, defining how human souls would move through and experience the sacred. St. Peter's presented unique challenges that nearly broke my aging mind. This wasn't just a building, it was the physical center of Catholic Christianity, the place where St. Peter was martyred, the spot from which papal authority would emanate for centuries. Every decision about proportion, lighting, structural support carried theological implications that terrified me. The previous architects had left me plans that were architecturally sound but spiritually inadequate. They designed a church that would have been magnificent but merely human in scale. I knew that anyone entering St. Peter's needed to be overwhelmed by a sense of divine grandeur that reduced human pride to appropriate humility whilst simultaneously elevating the soul toward heaven. My solution was the dome, that massive, impossible structure that still dominates the Roman skyline. But creating it required engineering innovations that didn't exist when I began. I had to become not just an architect, but a mathematician, an engineer, a master of materials science. The dome had to be simultaneously delicate enough to appear heavenly and strong enough to support its own enormous weight for centuries. Working in architecture also meant collaborating with dozens of specialists, master masons, structural engineers, decorative artists, logistics coordinators. This was agony for someone accustomed to solitary creative control. Every detail had to be explained, defended, sometimes negotiated rather than simply executed according to my vision. But the most profound difference was temporal. Sculpture and painting could be completed within my lifetime, but I knew from the beginning that St. Peter's would outlast me by decades, perhaps centuries. I was designing for architects I would never meet, solving problems for craftsmen not yet born, creating spaces for worshippers who wouldn't exist until long after my death. This required a different kind of artistic ego, less immediate, more patient, focused on perpetual rather than personal legacy. I had to trust that future builders would understand my intentions, that they would resist the temptation to improve my designs according to changing fashions or political pressures. The mathematical complexities were staggering. The dome's curves had to be calculated to distribute weight in ways that stone construction had never attempted. I spent months working with mathematicians, testing scale models, exploring theoretical problems that no previous architect had encountered. It was like learning an entirely new language at an age when most minds resist change. But oh, the spiritual satisfaction, when I finally saw the dome rising according to my designs, when I understood that it would outlast every other creation of my lifetime, when I imagined centuries of pilgrims entering that sacred space and feeling their hearts lift toward God, that validation was worth every sleepless night of calculation and planning. And the architectural work also forced me to consider architecture's social dimensions in ways that sculpture never required. St. Peter's wasn't just an artistic statement, it was a gathering place for thousands of worshippers, a symbol of Catholic power, a destination for pilgrims from across the world. My design decisions would shape human behavior and spiritual experience for centuries. I learned to think in terms of movement through space rather than static visual impact. How would light change throughout the day? How would crowds flow during major ceremonies? How would the building's proportions affect acoustic properties? Architecture required orchestrating experiences rather than simply creating objects. My final years were dominated by architectural concerns that consumed my remaining energy but also provided my deepest artistic satisfaction. I understood that the dome of St. Peter's would be my true monument, the creation most likely to survive and influence future generations. Everything else I had made was precious but portable. Architecture was permanent, unavoidable, a gift to the future that couldn't be moved or altered without enormous effort and expense. Even now, knowing that the basilica was completed according to my vision, I feel a satisfaction different from any other artistic achievement. I changed the Roman skyline permanently, created a space where millions of souls will encounter the divine across centuries. That's immortality of a different order than even the greatest sculpture or painting can achieve.
That sense of permanent legacy is powerful, given that you lived through such turbulent political times, the rise and fall of the Medici, wars, political upheavals. What were your political views? Did you ever use your art for social commentary?
Politics. It was the unavoidable backdrop to every artistic decision, the context that could elevate or destroy careers, the force that shaped which stories could be told and how they could be told. But my relationship with politics was complicated by my belief that divine truth transcends human political arrangements. I lived through the expulsion of the Medici from Florence, the rise of Savonarola's religious republic, the return of the Medici, the wars between city-states, the sack of Rome. Political upheaval was the constant condition of my adult life. Every commission carried political implications. Every patron represented particular factional interests. The David, for instance, was intensely political, despite appearing to be simply a religious sculpture. We placed him in front of the Palazzo Vecchio as a symbol of Republican Florence's defiance against larger, more powerful enemies. David's expression, alert, determined, ready for battle, spoke to Florentines facing threats from the Papal States, from foreign invasion, from internal political division. But I tried to encode my political messages in ways that transcended immediate partisan concerns. David wasn't just about Republican versus Medici politics. He represented the eternal principle that righteousness can triumph over overwhelming force when guided by divine purpose. That message remains relevant regardless of which political faction happens to be in power. My political views were shaped by my understanding of divine justice more than earthly political theory. I believed that legitimate authority came from God, but that earthly rulers could forfeit their divine mandate through corruption, cruelty, or abandonment of moral principles. This made me suspicious of all political power whilst remaining committed to the idea that good government was possible. The Sistine Chapel's Last Judgment was my most daring political statement, painted during a period when the Catholic Church faced unprecedented challenges from Protestant reformers. I painted Christ as a figure of terrifying divine justice, surrounded by saints who looked more like avenging angels than gentle intercessors. The message was clear. Divine judgment would separate the righteous from the corrupt, regardless of earthly rank or religious office. Some of my political commentary was subtle enough that only informed viewers would recognize it. In the chapel's prophets and sibyls, I included figures whose historical association suggested criticism of contemporary church leadership. The Delphic Sibyl, for instance, was traditionally associated with warnings about institutional corruption. Hardly an accident during the reign of popes who seemed more interested in temporal power than spiritual guidance. But I also learned the dangers of political art during the siege of Florence in 1529–30. I had sided with the Republican government against the returning Medici, even helping to design fortifications against the papal armies. When the Medici regained control, I had to flee the city and seek forgiveness for my political choices. Art provided no protection against political consequences. That experience taught me to embed political messages in religious allegory rather than making direct contemporary references. Biblical stories allowed me to comment on current events whilst maintaining plausible spiritual interpretation. Moses breaking the tablets of the law could be read as divine judgment on corrupt leadership without explicitly naming contemporary targets. My deepest political conviction was that artists had special responsibilities to speak truth to power, but that this truth-telling had to be strategic rather than suicidal. Direct confrontation would simply get artists killed or silenced. Subtle commentary embedded in commissioned works could plant seeds of moral reflection that might eventually influence political behavior. I was particularly concerned with the relationship between wealth and spiritual integrity, themes that permeated my later works. The increasing luxury of papal courts, the growing gap between church teaching and church practice, the use of religious art for purely political purposes. These developments horrified me as both an artist and a faithful Catholic, but I also understood that political stability was necessary for artistic achievement. The greatest art requires patronage, materials, time, and security that only stable governments can provide. Revolutionary periods might be morally exciting, but they rarely produced conditions conducive to creating lasting beauty. My final political view was that art itself was inherently political because it shaped how people understood beauty, truth, and divine purpose. Every artistic choice was also a moral choice. Every aesthetic decision carried implications for how viewers would understand their relationship to God and to political authority. I tried to use my influence to encourage political leaders toward justice, beauty, and spiritual integrity, but always through the indirect means of creating works so obviously touched by divine inspiration that they would shame viewers out of purely selfish political calculations. Art was my political weapon, beauty my form of social commentary.
That balance between truth-telling and survival shows such wisdom. As we near the end of our conversation, I'm curious about your regrets. If you could live your life again, what would you change?
Regrets? Where do I even begin? I lived 88 years, and I swear that at least half of them were spent in some form of regret. Regret about choices made, opportunities missed, words spoken in anger, love withheld out of fear. My greatest regret is that I was too frightened to love openly and completely. I let fear of scandal, fear of divine judgment, fear of vulnerability rob me of the human connections that could have enriched both my life and my art. Tommaso de Cavalieri offered me a love that could have transformed my understanding of divine beauty, but I was too terrified of my own desires to accept his gift fully. If I could live again, I would risk loving more courageously. I would trust that God's understanding is broader than human doctrine suggests, that divine love encompasses all forms of genuine human affection. The loneliness I accepted as necessary for artistic purity was really just cowardice disguised as devotion. I regret my cruelty to students and assistants, my impossibly high standards, my impatience with normal human limitations, my assumption that everyone should share my willingness to sacrifice everything for art. These attitudes drove away people who could have become both better artists and dear friends. My pursuit of perfection in art made me imperfect in human relationships. I would change my relationship with my unfinished works. Instead of abandoning sculptures when they didn't meet my impossible standards, I would learn to accept beautiful imperfection, to understand that very good can serve divine beauty almost as well as perfect. My all-or-nothing approach wasted years of potential creation and left too many figures trapped in stone forever. I regret not sharing my knowledge more generously. I hoarded artistic insights out of pride and fear, taking techniques and spiritual understanding to the grave rather than trusting others to use them wisely. If I had been more open about my methods, more patient in teaching, perhaps the Renaissance tradition of great art could have continued more seamlessly. I would change my financial anxieties. Too much of my mental energy was consumed by worry about money, about meeting expenses, about negotiating with difficult patrons. If I had learned earlier that financial security was achievable through sensible planning, I could have focused more completely on artistic creation and less on economic survival. My perfectionism was both gift and curse, but if I could live again, I would try to distinguish more clearly between perfectionism that serves divine beauty and perfectionism that serves human ego. Too often I was cruel to myself and others, not because God demanded it, but because I was terrified of criticism or failure. I regret not traveling more, not studying the artistic traditions of other cultures more systematically. I was so focused on Italian Renaissance ideals that I missed opportunities to learn from Byzantine, Islamic, Northern European approaches to beauty. My artistic vision was narrower than it needed to be. I would change my relationship with my own body. I treated my flesh as an obstacle to spiritual achievement rather than understanding it as a divine creation worthy of care and appreciation. The physical suffering I endured for my art was partly necessary, but much of it was self-imposed punishment that served no higher purpose. I regret my social isolation. Yes, solitude was necessary for my deepest creative work, but I took isolation too far, cutting myself off from the ordinary human pleasures that could have sustained my spirit during difficult periods. I could have maintained both artistic dedication and social connection if I had been less extreme in my choices. If I could live again, I would trust divine providence more completely. So much of my anxiety came from believing that everything depended on my own effort, my own vigilance, my own perfection. I would try to understand earlier that God's purposes are larger than any individual artist's contribution, that doing my faithful best was sufficient without achieving absolute perfection. I would change my relationship with criticism. I was so terrified of judgment that I sometimes avoided risks that could have led to even greater beauty. Fear of failure prevented me from attempting some works that might have surpassed even my greatest achievements. But perhaps my deepest regret is that I spent too many years believing that suffering was required for spiritual authenticity. Yes, great art demands sacrifice, but I confused necessary difficulty with unnecessary misery. I could have served divine beauty just as faithfully whilst allowing myself more human happiness along the way. Still, even with all these regrets, I'm grateful for the life I lived, the beauty I was privileged to create, the divine insights I was granted, the opportunity to serve God through art. These gifts were worth the struggles. But if I could offer advice to my younger self, it would be this: serve divine beauty with everything you have. But don't forget that you yourself are also divine beauty, worthy of the same love and care you pour into your creations.
That advice to your younger self is profound and moving. Speaking of advice, what would you tell young artists today who are just beginning their creative journeys?
Young artists, if I could gather them all around this table, if I could save them from even half the mistakes I made, what a gift that would be. Listen carefully, you who are just beginning to understand that creation is your calling. First and most important, trust your gift completely, but hold your ego lightly. The ability to create beauty is divine blessing, not personal achievement. You are the vessel, not the source. When you remember this, you'll work with humility instead of pride, and humility produces better art than ego ever can. Learn your craft obsessively, but don't confuse technical skill with artistic truth. Master every technique available to you: drawing, composition, color theory, anatomy, perspective. But remember that these are languages for expressing beauty, not ends in themselves. A perfectly executed work that says nothing meaningful is worse than an imperfect work that moves souls. Study the masters, but don't try to become them. Examine how Leonardo understood light, how ancient sculptors achieved perfect proportion, how great architects create emotional space. Absorb their lessons, then forget them completely when you're creating your own work. Your job isn't to repeat what's been done. It's to discover what only you can contribute to the world's beauty. Develop physical resilience early. Art is more demanding on the body than most people realize. Protect your hands, strengthen your back, care for your eyes. The romantic image of the suffering artist is nonsense. Unnecessary physical breakdown doesn't improve your art. It shortens your creative lifespan. Find patrons, but never let them own your vision. Yes, you need money to buy materials and survive whilst creating, but maintain some independence always. The moment you become completely dependent on others' approval, your art begins serving their limitations instead of divine beauty. Don't be afraid of difficulty or apparent failure. Every great artist produces terrible work whilst learning. I have sketches that would embarrass a competent apprentice. The difference between great artists and abandoned dreams isn't initial talent. It's willingness to continue working through periods of apparent inadequacy. Surround yourself with people who understand your calling, even if they can't share it. Artists need community, need relationships with people who won't try to talk them out of the difficult path they've chosen, but also maintain connections with non-artists who can remind you that beauty serves life, not the other way around. Learn to distinguish between constructive criticism and envious destruction. Some feedback will genuinely help you improve. Other commentary comes from people who want to diminish your gifts because they highlight their own limitations. Trust your inner sense of which is which. Don't rush toward recognition or commercial success. The art world is full of people who achieved early fame by creating what was immediately popular rather than what was truly necessary. Build your skill, develop your vision, create work that satisfies your own understanding of beauty. Recognition will follow if it's meant to, but it can't be your primary goal. Pray, meditate, or however you connect with the source of inspiration. Art without spiritual foundation becomes mere decoration. Whether you call it God, the universe, creative spirit, or something else entirely, acknowledge that your best work comes through you rather than from you. Accept that artistic life requires sacrifice, but don't sacrifice unnecessarily. Yes, great art demands time, energy, focus that might otherwise go to conventional pleasures. But don't become so obsessed with your calling that you forget to live, love, experience the ordinary human joys that actually feed artistic understanding. Study anatomy if you want to depict life, but remember that technical knowledge serves emotional truth. The greatest artistic achievements combine perfect skill with genuine feeling. Neither alone is sufficient. Keep some work private, some creative space that's not for sale or exhibition. Artists need a protected realm where they can experiment, fail, discover without external pressure. Public work and private exploration feed each other. Don't compare your beginning to others' mastery. Every great artist was once exactly where you are now, uncertain, struggling, wondering if their gifts were real or imaginary. The path looks impossible from the beginning, but it becomes clear one step at a time. Finally, remember that your art outlasts your life. Create work that will speak to people you'll never meet, solve problems you'll never fully understand, serve beauty that transcends any individual artist's limited perspective. You're not just expressing yourself, you're adding to the world's store of divine beauty. The artistic path is difficult but magnificent, lonely but meaningful, demanding but ultimately generous. Trust your gifts, develop your skills, serve something greater than yourself, and create beauty that helps others remember how wonderful it is to be alive.
That guidance feels like a blessing. You've mentioned God and spirituality throughout our conversation, but I'd love to hear you speak directly about your personal relationship with the divine. How did you experience God?
My relationship with God. It was the defining reality of my existence. More intimate than any human connection, more constant than my own heartbeat, more essential than breath itself, but also more complicated, more demanding, more transformative than any simple devotion could contain. I experienced God primarily as the source of beauty, the divine artist whose creation I was privileged to study and attempt to echo in my own limited way. Every sunrise, every human face, every flower or stone or bird revealed aspects of divine creativity that left me breathless with wonder and desperate to capture some fragment of that eternal beauty in temporal materials. But my God wasn't the distant philosophical deity of academic theology. My God was intimately present in my workshop, guiding my hands when I carved, inspiring my vision when I painted, suffering with me during periods of creative struggle. I felt divine presence most intensely when I was working, not as external observer, but as collaborating partner in ongoing creation. Prayer for me wasn't reciting formal words, but engaging in continuous conversation with the divine artist about the work we were creating together. Show me David's true expression, I would pray whilst carving. Help me understand the colour of divine love, I would ask whilst mixing pigments for the chapel ceiling. These weren't requests for miraculous intervention. They were invitations for divine guidance in practical artistic decisions. I experienced God as both infinitely demanding and infinitely patient. Demanding because divine beauty deserved nothing less than my complete devotion, my highest skill, my willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for artistic truth. But patient because God continued working through me despite my failures, continued offering inspiration despite my inadequacies, continued trusting me with visions I wasn't quite capable of executing. My faith was tested constantly by the gap between divine perfection and human limitation. I could see so clearly the perfect beauty that needed to be created, but my hands could only approximate that vision. This tension between divine inspiration and human capacity was both the source of my greatest suffering and the force that drove me toward excellence. I found God in the resistance of marble almost as much as in its cooperation. When stone fought back against my chisel, when pigments refused to blend as I envisioned, when my body failed to sustain the work my spirit demanded, these obstacles weren't divine punishment, but divine teaching. Lessons about humility, persistence, the relationship between will and surrender. The Catholic Church provided the framework for my faith but couldn't contain its full reality. I was orthodox in my beliefs. I truly accepted Catholic doctrine about Christ's sacrifice, Mary's intercession, the authority of Scripture. But my personal experience of God was more immediate, more collaborative, more artistic than official theology could accommodate. During my darkest periods, when commissions failed or patrons disappointed me or loneliness became unbearable, I experienced God as companion in suffering rather than rescuer from it. Divine presence didn't eliminate difficulty but transformed its meaning, helped me understand that creative struggle was a form of participation in Christ's passion. I learned to recognize different qualities of divine inspiration. Sometimes God spoke through sudden flashes of artistic insight that solved problems I had wrestled with for months. Other times, divine guidance came as gradual understanding that emerged through patient, sustained effort. Both were authentic spiritual experiences, but they required different responses from me. My understanding of sin was shaped by my artistic calling. Sin for me wasn't primarily about moral transgression, but about wasted opportunities to serve beauty, moments when I chose personal comfort over divine calling, times when I created mediocre work because I was too lazy or frightened to attempt excellence. I experienced divine love most powerfully through the privilege of creating beauty that moved other souls toward God. When someone wept before my Pietà, when viewers felt their hearts lift whilst gazing at the chapel ceiling, when David inspired courage in those facing their own giants, in those moments I felt God's love flowing through my work to touch other hearts. But I also struggled with divine justice, particularly during the corruption scandals that plagued the church during my lifetime. How could God allow his representatives to behave so badly? Why didn't divine intervention prevent the suffering of innocents? These questions tormented me, but ultimately strengthened rather than weakened my faith by forcing me toward more mature spiritual understanding. In my final years, I experienced God less as demanding taskmaster and more as loving Father welcoming me home after a long, difficult journey. The artistic visions that had driven me so relentlessly gave way to simpler appreciation for divine presence itself. Gratitude for having been chosen to participate in the ongoing creation of beauty. My last prayer, whispered as I lay dying, was simply, "Thank you for letting me serve." No requests, no complaints, no bargaining, just overwhelming gratitude for the privilege of spending my life in collaboration with divine creativity.
That relationship with God through your art is deeply moving. Throughout your life dedicated to creating beauty, how did you understand ugliness? What role did it play in your artistic vision?
Ugliness. People assume that someone devoted to creating beauty would simply reject or ignore ugliness, but the truth is more complex. I spent my life learning that ugliness and beauty are not opposites but partners in revealing divine truth, that understanding one requires intimate knowledge of the other. True ugliness, I discovered, is not physical imperfection, but spiritual emptiness, the absence of divine purpose, the rejection of meaning, the choice to create or accept meaninglessness where beauty could exist. A scarred face can possess profound beauty if it reflects a soul that has struggled toward truth. A conventionally perfect form can be utterly ugly if it serves only vanity or deception. I learned this lesson most powerfully whilst dissecting corpses in monastery basements. The dead bodies I studied were physically repulsive, rotting, dismembered, violated by death and decay, but they taught me the architecture of divine creation more clearly than any living model could. In that apparent ugliness, I discovered the miraculous engineering of human anatomy, the perfect mathematical relationships that govern proportion and movement. My artistic challenge was learning to depict physical imperfection in ways that revealed spiritual beauty. The dying figures in my later Pietàs are broken, suffering, physically diminished by death, but I carved them to show how spiritual love transcends physical limitation, how divine beauty shines through rather than despite human frailty. Ugliness served another crucial purpose in my work. It provided contrast that made beauty more visible and meaningful. Without shadows, light cannot be appreciated. Without discord, harmony lacks impact. Some of my most beautiful figures are surrounded by deliberately ugly elements that heighten their spiritual radiance through contrast. I also came to understand that artistic beauty often emerges from engaging honestly with ugly realities rather than avoiding them. The terrifying Christ of my Last Judgment is beautiful precisely because he doesn't shy away from the ugly reality of divine justice, the necessary separation of souls who chose beauty from those who chose spiritual emptiness. But I had to learn to distinguish between ugliness that serves artistic truth and ugliness that corrupts it. Some contemporary artists seemed to believe that depicting ugly subjects automatically created meaningful art, but simply showing ugly things without revealing any deeper beauty or truth is just ugly. Ugliness for its own sake serves no divine purpose. The most dangerous form of ugliness I encountered was aesthetic corruption, beauty used for evil purposes, artistic skill employed to deceive rather than illuminate. When artists create beautiful propaganda for corrupt leaders, when they use their gifts to make evil appear attractive, they commit sins against both art and truth that horrify me more than simple incompetence ever could. I learned that my artistic responsibility wasn't to avoid ugliness, but to transform it, to find ways of depicting even horrible realities that served divine beauty rather than celebrating human degradation. The violence in my religious works acknowledges the ugly reality of sin and suffering whilst pointing toward the beautiful possibility of redemption. Physical ugliness often taught me more about beauty than perfect models could. When I drew beggars, cripples, aged faces marked by suffering, I discovered forms of beauty invisible in conventional prettiness, the beauty of endurance, of dignity maintained despite adversity, of souls that had been refined rather than broken by difficulty. But I also had to resist the temptation to romanticize ugliness, to pretend that all suffering automatically produces beauty or that poverty and pain are somehow preferable to health and happiness. Ugliness remains ugly. The artist's job is to find whatever beauty exists within or beyond it, not to deny ugly realities or pretend they don't matter. My mature understanding is that God creates through both beauty and ugliness, uses both harmony and discord to reveal different aspects of divine truth. Beautiful things teach us about divine perfection, perfect order, the way creation was meant to be. Ugly things teach us about divine mercy, the possibility of redemption, the way love persists even when creation is broken. The artist who understands only beauty creates decoration. The artist who understands only ugliness creates despair. But the artist who understands how beauty and ugliness interact, how they depend on each other to reveal complete truth, that artist can create works that transform souls, that help viewers understand both the tragedy and the glory of human existence. In my final years, I became less concerned with avoiding ugliness and more focused on ensuring that every element in my work, beautiful or ugly, served the larger purpose of revealing divine love. Even the most disturbing aspects of my late works point toward beauty. Even the most beautiful elements acknowledge the reality of suffering that makes redemption necessary and precious.
That understanding of beauty and ugliness working together is profound. Thinking about your long career, what were your greatest moments of pride? When did you feel most successful as an artist?
Pride. It's dangerous for an artist to feel too much pride, but there were moments, blessed, transcendent moments, when I felt that divine grace had flowed through my work so clearly that even my humble efforts achieved something approaching the beauty God intended. The first time I saw David standing in the Piazza della Signoria, surrounded by all of Florence, watching grown men weep before a sculpture I had carved, that was perhaps my deepest moment of artistic fulfillment. Not pride in my skill, but wonder that God had chosen to work through my inadequate hands to create something that could move souls to tears, that could make an entire city feel stronger and more hopeful. But even more moving was a quiet moment weeks later when I saw a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, standing before David, completely absorbed, unconsciously mimicking the statue's stance. In that child's unconscious response, I understood that my work had achieved something beyond mere artistic achievement. It had become a teacher, showing that boy what courage looks like when facing impossible odds. The completion of the Sistine Chapel ceiling provided a different kind of satisfaction. When I finally descended from that scaffolding for the last time, when I could see the entire composition unified after 4 years of working on individual sections, I experienced something approaching divine ecstasy. I had participated in telling the complete story of creation, fall, and redemption on a scale and with an ambition that no artist had ever attempted. But my proudest moment came during the chapel's first major service, when I watched bishops, cardinals, even the Pope himself gaze upward in wonder. These were sophisticated men, accustomed to luxury and beauty, yet they stood transfixed by painted figures on plaster. In their faces I saw the same spiritual transport that I had felt whilst creating the work. The unveiling of my Pietà provided perhaps my most personally satisfying moment of recognition. I was still young, barely 25, working in Rome where no one knew my capabilities. When people first saw that sculpture, Mary cradling her dead son with such tender grief, the silence was profound. Then someone began to pray, and within minutes the entire chapel was filled with quiet devotion. What moved me most wasn't the artistic praise, but the spiritual response. People weren't admiring my technical skill. They were genuinely moved toward prayer and contemplation. My marble had become a window to divine love, helping viewers understand something about God's mercy that words couldn't convey. I felt deep satisfaction when Pope Julius II, notorious for his temper and impatience, stood speechless before the completed chapel ceiling. This was a man who commanded armies, who ruled much of Italy, yet my painted figures left him temporarily unable to speak. When he finally found words, all he could say was, "Magnificent, truly magnificent." But perhaps my strangest moment of pride came from criticism rather than praise. When some cardinals complained that my figures in the Last Judgment were too nude, too sensual for sacred space, I felt oddly vindicated. They were responding to the power of my work, recognizing that it challenged comfortable assumptions about divine truth. Controversy meant my art was alive, dangerous, transformative rather than merely decorative. I treasure the memory of working with the finest marble I ever encountered, a block of Carrara stone so perfect it seemed to glow from within. As I carved that particular piece, I felt complete harmony between vision, material, and execution. Every chisel strike revealed exactly what I had hoped to find, as though the stone was eager to become beautiful. One of my deepest satisfactions came from letters I received from artists across Europe describing how my work had influenced their own understanding of art's possibilities. A young sculptor from Germany wrote that seeing David had convinced him that stone could indeed be brought to life. A painter from France credited the chapel ceiling with teaching him new approaches to composition and color. But my most meaningful moment of pride was intensely personal and private. Near the end of my life, whilst working on my final Pietà, I achieved a moment of perfect harmony between my spiritual understanding and my artistic technique. For perhaps an hour, I carved in a state of complete divine inspiration, feeling as though Christ himself was guiding my hands. When I stepped back and saw what I had created during that transcendent hour, Mary's face expressing grief that somehow contained hope, love that transformed rather than denied loss, I understood that I had finally achieved what I had spent my entire life attempting, art that was simultaneously perfectly human and genuinely divine. That moment lasted only briefly, and I never quite recaptured it, but it showed me what artistic achievement could be at its highest level. Not self-expression or technical display, but genuine collaboration between human skill and divine inspiration in service of beauty that could transform souls. These moments of pride weren't about personal achievement, but about gratitude for being chosen as an instrument of divine creativity. The greatest satisfaction any artist can experience is knowing that their work has served something larger than themselves.
Those moments of transcendence sound incredible. You lived during an era of extraordinary artistic achievement. How did you see yourself in relation to your contemporaries like Raphael, Titian, or Bramante?
My contemporaries. We were like musicians in the same orchestra, each playing different instruments but contributing to the same divine symphony. Yet I confess there was rivalry, comparison, sometimes jealousy that complicated what should have been pure artistic fellowship. Raphael was perhaps the most difficult for me to understand and appreciate. His gift was so different from mine. Where I struggled and suffered for every achievement, he seemed to create beauty effortlessly, with a grace and harmony that appeared almost supernatural. His paintings possessed a serenity, a perfect balance that I could admire but never emulate. But I sometimes wondered if Raphael's apparent ease was actually a limitation. Beauty came so naturally to him that he perhaps never experienced the spiritual wrestling that I believed was necessary for the deepest artistic truth. His Madonnas were lovely, but did they reveal anything about the cost of divine love? His portraits were magnificent, but did they explore the complexity of souls marked by sin and redemption? I respected Raphael enormously, but I also felt that his art served different purposes than mine. He created beauty that comforted and pleased. I tried to create beauty that challenged and transformed. Both approaches serve God, but they require different temperaments, different relationships with difficulty and doubt. Titian fascinated me because his mastery of color surpassed anything I ever achieved in painting. When I saw his work, I understood that there were aspects of visual beauty, the way light plays across flesh, the subtle gradations of atmospheric perspective, the emotional possibilities of pure color that my focus on sculpture and drawing had prevented me from fully exploring. But Titian's greatest strength was also perhaps a weakness from my perspective. His technical mastery was so complete that it sometimes seemed to become an end in itself. I would see paintings of his that were flawlessly executed but wondered what they were trying to say beyond, "Look how beautifully I can paint." Technical perfection without spiritual urgency felt incomplete to me. Bramante presented different challenges because we worked in related fields. He as architect, I as sculptor, interested in architectural problems. His understanding of space and proportion was extraordinary. His ability to create buildings that elevated the soul whilst serving practical functions was genuinely inspired. But I sometimes felt that Bramante was too willing to compromise artistic vision for political or financial expedience. Where I would fight patrons to preserve essential elements of my designs, he would adapt his plans to suit changing circumstances. This flexibility made him more successful politically, but left me wondering if he cared enough about his artistic integrity. The truth is that comparing artists is ultimately meaningless because each of us was called to serve divine beauty in unique ways. Leonardo's scientific curiosity led him to artistic innovations I could never have imagined. Donatello's understanding of psychological expression in sculpture taught me lessons I used throughout my career. Even artists I considered inferior to myself possessed insights and techniques that I benefited from studying. But I confess that competition drove me to achievements I might not have attempted without rivals breathing down my neck. When I heard that Leonardo was also commissioned for battle scenes in the Palazzo Vecchio, my determination to surpass his work pushed me to innovations in composition and anatomy that served me for the rest of my career. The most painful aspect of artistic rivalry was watching politics corrupt relationships that should have been based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Instead of collaborating to advance the cause of divine beauty, we were often positioned as competitors fighting for limited patronage and recognition. I regret that I didn't form closer friendships with my contemporaries, didn't create opportunities for artistic fellowship that could have enriched all our work. Imagine what we could have achieved working together rather than in suspicious isolation. Leonardo's scientific insights combined with my understanding of anatomy, Raphael's compositional harmony married to my psychological intensity, Titian's color mastery integrated with my sculptural solidity. But perhaps artistic rivalry served divine purposes I couldn't see at the time. Competition forced each of us to develop our unique gifts more completely, to find artistic solutions that collaboration might not have discovered. The Renaissance flourished partly because great artists were constantly challenging each other to surpass previous achievements. In my final years, I came to understand that my contemporaries and I were really servants in the same household, each given different tasks, but all working to increase the store of beauty available to future generations. Our individual achievements mattered less than our collective contribution to human understanding of divine creativity. The greatest contemporary artists shared one crucial quality regardless of their different approaches. They were all genuinely called to serve beauty rather than simply pursuing personal success. This calling distinguished them from merely competent craftsmen and connected them to the great tradition of artistic service that stretches back to the beginning of human creativity and forward to artists not yet born.
That vision of artists as servants in the same household is beautiful. Now, speaking from your perspective across the centuries, what do you think about the modern world? What would surprise or concern you about how art has evolved?
The modern world. If you had told me during my lifetime that people would someday carry tiny devices containing all human knowledge, that they could see artworks from across the globe instantaneously, that moving pictures could tell stories with unprecedented realism, I would have thought you were describing divine visions rather than earthly reality. What astounds me most is the democratization of artistic creation. In my time, art required wealthy patrons, expensive materials, years of apprenticeship to masters. Now, I'm told, anyone can create and share their work with the entire world. This is simultaneously wonderful and terrifying. Wonderful because divine creativity shouldn't be limited to those born into privilege. Terrifying because the ease of creation might diminish appreciation for the difficulty required to achieve genuine excellence. The speed of modern life both excites and worries me. Artists can now experiment, fail, and try again in ways that would have been impossible when each canvas cost a month's wages, when each block of marble represented enormous investment. But does this abundance encourage deeper exploration or shallower commitment? When everything is possible, do artists still choose to sacrifice everything for their greatest visions? I'm fascinated by what you call digital art. The ability to create beauty using light and mathematics rather than physical materials. Part of me wonders if this represents the ultimate artistic freedom, liberation from the constraints of marble and pigment that limited my own expression. But another part fears that art without physical struggle, without resistance from materials, might lose some essential quality that emerges from wrestling with stubborn reality. The global nature of modern art both thrills and concerns me. Artists can now learn from traditions across all cultures and centuries, can synthesize influences I could never have imagined. But does this infinite access lead to genuine synthesis or mere superficial borrowing? Are modern artists creating new forms of beauty or simply recombining existing elements without deeper understanding? What would surprise me most is learning that many modern artists deliberately reject beauty as a primary goal, that some consider the pursuit of beautiful art to be somehow suspect or limited. In my time, beauty was understood as a pathway to divine truth. The idea that art should be ugly or disturbing for its own sake would have seemed like voluntary spiritual blindness. But perhaps I'm misunderstanding something crucial about modern artistic purposes. If contemporary artists are using ugliness to reveal truth, if they're employing discord to comment on social injustice or spiritual emptiness, then they might be serving beauty in ways I didn't anticipate. The means look different, but the end goal of revealing truth through artistic creation remains constant. I would be deeply concerned about what I imagine is the overwhelming flood of images in modern life. In my time, most people encountered perhaps dozens of visual artworks in their entire lives. Each image carried weight, demanded contemplation. If people now see thousands of images daily, how can any single work achieve the contemplative depth that transforms souls? The speed of modern communication would both delight and terrify me. Ideas can now spread across the world in moments rather than decades, allowing artistic innovations to influence global creativity almost instantaneously. But this same speed might prevent the deep reflection that great art requires both to create and to appreciate. I would be curious about modern patronage systems. If wealthy individuals and religious institutions no longer dominate artistic funding, who decides which art gets created? Do democratic societies produce better or worse art than aristocratic ones? Does art created for mass audiences serve divine beauty as effectively as art created for educated elites? The environmental possibilities of modern technology would astound me. Artists can now create works on scales I never dreamed possible, can manipulate light and sound and space in ways that approach the divine creativity I spent my life trying to echo. But I would worry that these vast possibilities might overwhelm human artistic judgment, that the means might become more important than the spiritual ends they're meant to serve. What would concern me most is if modern artists have lost connection to the spiritual dimensions of creation, if art has become purely secular self-expression rather than humble service to divine beauty. Art that serves only the artist's ego or society's immediate concerns might be clever or fashionable, but it can't provide the spiritual nourishment that great art offers across centuries. But perhaps I'm being unfairly nostalgic. Every generation of artists faces unique challenges and opportunities. Modern artists must navigate complexities I never had to consider. If they maintain genuine devotion to creating beauty that serves something greater than themselves, if they're willing to sacrifice personal comfort for artistic truth, then they're continuing the same essential work regardless of how different their tools and contexts might be. My hope for future artists is that they'll use their unprecedented freedoms and capabilities to create beauty more profound than any previous generation achieved, whilst remembering that the ultimate purpose of art isn't innovation for its own sake, but service to the eternal human need for transcendent beauty.
Your perspective on modern art is fascinating. As we approach the end of our conversation, I'd love to hear your final reflections on life's meaning. After 8 decades of creating some of humanity's greatest art, what did it all mean?
Life's meaning. After 88 years of struggling to create beauty worthy of its divine source, after decades of wrestling with stone and pigment and my own inadequate soul, I understand now that the meaning was never in the destination, but in the journey itself, never in what I achieved, but in what achieving it cost and taught me. The meaning of my life was learning to serve something infinitely greater than myself, whilst discovering that this service somehow made me more fully myself than any selfish pursuit ever could. Every hour spent in devotion to divine beauty, every sacrifice made for artistic truth, every moment when I forgot my own comfort in pursuit of perfect expression, these were the moments when I became most authentically human. I spent decades believing that my life's meaning would be found in my completed masterpieces, in the immortal works that would outlast my mortal flesh. But I understand now that the works themselves were never the point. They were simply the visible evidence of an invisible transformation that occurred within my soul through the process of creating them. The real masterpiece wasn't David or the Sistine Chapel or any sculpture that tourists now admire. The real masterpiece was the gradual transformation of a frightened, self-centered young man into someone capable of sustained devotion to beauty, someone willing to sacrifice personal happiness for the privilege of adding genuine beauty to God's creation. Life's meaning, I now see, was found in those countless moments of pure creative absorption when time seemed to stop, when my conscious mind stepped aside and divine inspiration flowed through tools guided by hands that no longer felt like my own. In those blessed intervals, I experienced what I believe is the purpose of human existence, conscious participation in ongoing divine creation. But the meaning was equally present in the suffering, the physical pain of carving for 14 hours, the spiritual agony of falling short of my vision, the emotional cost of choosing art over human love. That suffering wasn't meaningless punishment. It was the price required for genuine spiritual development, the resistance against which souls develop strength and depth. I lived to understand that human life achieves meaning not through avoiding difficulty, but through choosing what to suffer for. Suffering for selfish purposes creates only bitterness and resentment, but suffering in service of beauty, truth, love, or divine purpose transforms both the sufferer and the world around them. The meaning of my life was also found in recognizing my place in the great continuum of human creativity that stretches from the first cave painter to artists not yet born. I was neither the beginning nor the end of that tradition, but simply one voice in an eternal conversation about beauty, one instrument in an infinite orchestra playing divine music. Every figure I carved, every scene I painted was really a love letter to the God who had given me eyes to see beauty, hands to create it, and a soul capable of recognizing the sacred in the material world. My entire artistic output was an extended prayer, a decades-long thank you for the privilege of existence in a universe where beauty is possible. But perhaps the deepest meaning came from understanding that my individual achievements mattered far less than my contribution to the collective human effort to make divine beauty visible in the material world. David will crumble eventually, the Sistine Chapel will fade, but the human capacity for creating transcendent beauty will continue as long as consciousness exists. The meaning of my life was learning that love and beauty are really the same thing approached from different directions, that creating beautiful art was my way of loving God, loving humanity, loving existence itself. Every perfect curve carved in marble was an expression of love made permanent. I lived to understand that the artist's highest calling isn't self-expression but self-transcendence, becoming so completely devoted to serving beauty that personal ego dissolves into something larger and more meaningful. The moments when I achieved this self-transcendence were the moments when my life achieved its truest meaning. In my final years, I realized that the meaning wasn't even primarily about art. Art was simply the vehicle through which I learned the deeper lessons that gave life significance, how to serve something greater than myself, how to transform suffering into beauty, how to love without expecting return. how to participate humbly in divine creativity. The ultimate meaning of my life was discovering that every human soul is called to be an artist in some sense, not necessarily creating paintings or sculptures, but finding ways to add beauty, meaning, and love to the world through whatever gifts and circumstances they've been given. I lived 88 years to learn what could perhaps be stated simply: the meaning of life is learning to love so completely that you become willing to sacrifice everything for the beloved, and then discovering that this total sacrifice somehow gives you everything that truly matters.
Michelangelo, as our final question, would you offer a blessing for humanity, for all the artists, dreamers and seekers who will hear these words across the centuries?
My dear souls, my fellow seekers of beauty, my brothers and sisters in the great work of adding light to this world, I bless you with the courage to see truly, not just with your eyes, but with your hearts, your souls, your deepest understanding. May you see the divine spark hidden in every face, the sacred geometry underlying every natural form, the eternal love breathing through every moment of existence. I bless you with steady hands and clear vision for whatever creative work calls to your spirit. Whether you work in stone or song, in mathematics or medicine, in raising children or building communities, may your efforts be guided by the same divine inspiration that moved my chisel and brush. I bless you with the wisdom to know that perfection isn't the enemy of beauty but its humble servant. May you strive for excellence whilst accepting that your human limitations are not failures but the very conditions through which divine grace can shine most clearly. I bless you with the strength to endure necessary suffering, the difficulty that comes from reaching toward ideals higher than comfort, the resistance that makes your soul strong, the struggle that transforms ordinary lives into something luminous and meaningful. May you find the courage to love fully even when love demands sacrifice, even when it leads you away from conventional safety toward unknown territories of the heart. I, who chose loneliness over the risk of love, bless you with the bravery I lacked. May you trust that divine understanding encompasses all forms of genuine affection. I bless you with authentic communities of fellow seekers, people who understand your calling even when they cannot share it. Companions who will encourage your highest aspirations rather than trying to diminish them to manageable size. May you discover your unique way of serving the eternal human project of creating beauty, justice, truth, and love in this world. Not everyone is called to paint ceilings or carve statues, but everyone is called to add something beautiful to the great work of divine creation. I bless you with moments of transcendence when time stops and you feel yourself participating directly in the creative force that moves the stars. These moments cannot be earned or demanded, only received with gratitude when they come. May you learn the difference between meaningful difficulty and pointless suffering, between sacrifice that serves beauty and punishment that serves only ego. May you choose your struggles wisely and bear them nobly. I bless you with the peace that comes from knowing your efforts matter, that every sincere attempt to create beauty or express truth adds something irreplaceable to the world's store of light, even when you cannot see the full consequences of your work. May you find the humility to receive inspiration gratefully whilst taking responsibility for developing whatever gifts you've been given. You are neither the source of your talents nor excused from using them fully. I bless you with the long view, the understanding that your individual contributions are part of a vast, eternal conversation about what it means to be human, what it means to love, what it means to participate consciously in the ongoing creation of a universe where beauty and meaning are possible. Most importantly, I bless you with the recognition that you are already masterpieces, not perfect, but perfectly loved by the Creator who shaped you, who placed divine creativity within your soul, who calls you to the great work of adding beauty to existence. Sleep now in the knowledge that you are held by the same love that guided my hands, that inspired my vision, that sustained me through 8 decades of seeking divine beauty. That love surrounds you like the warmest embrace, protects you like the strongest fortress, calls you like the most beautiful music toward your own unique way of serving eternal truth. Dream of the beauty you're meant to create, the love you're meant to share, the masterpiece you're meant to become. And when you wake, remember that every new day is another opportunity to participate in the magnificent, eternal work of making divine love visible in this world. Voice fading to whisper, go in peace, create in joy, love without fear, and add your irreplaceable light to the great constellation of human beauty that spans the centuries. You are blessed, you are loved, you are called to greatness. May divine inspiration guide your hands, divine love fill your hearts, and divine peace sustain your souls, until we meet again in that place where all beauty finds its source and home.
And there we have it, 2 hours with Michelangelo in his final years. And what strikes me most is how his greatest masterpieces were born, not from divine ease, but from profoundly human struggle. The loneliness of perfection, the ache of forbidden love, and the relentless pursuit of beauty that demanded everything he had to give. Behind every perfect curve of David, every breathtaking scene on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, lived a man who understood that creating transcendent art requires nothing less than the willingness to sacrifice your entire life in service of something greater than yourself. Whether you're falling asleep to this conversation or listening with wide-awake inspiration, I hope you've heard something that reminds you that you too are called to create beauty in your own unique way. In a world that often mistakes perfection for excellence and comfort for happiness, Michelangelo's voice reminds us that the most meaningful life is one spent in devoted service to love, beauty, and truth, even when that service costs us everything we thought we wanted. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Tea with Tyrants and Heroes. Next week, we'll be travelling back through time once again to share tea with another mysterious figure from history, someone whose story will surprise you in ways you never expected. Until then, sleep well, knowing that you are held by love that transcends time itself.